Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku discovered Toshinori Yagi's secret as All Might? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. It had been quite some time since Toshinori walked through the halls of his alma mater. Having just been 18 at the time of graduation, it felt like a full lifetime had passed in between then and now. At the same time, the halls felt just as familiar as they did when he would walk through them on the daily. The difference was that now, he wasn't being greeted by friends and strangers alike with warm smiles and greetings, but instead was met with polite indifference by any passerbys in the hall. Because right now, he was not the first year who won the sports festival or the boy who aced every endurance test he was put to. He was Toshinori Yagi, a complete nobody to everyone, save for a select few. To most, Toshinori was just another secretary-manager working at All Might's hero agency who left many wondering just how he managed to get so close to the #1 hero and symbol of peace despite dressing in clothes that never seemed to fit him or constantly stumbling over his words, if not his own feet. Little did they know that the secretary-manager they thought they knew was the symbol of peace himself, at least when his time wasn't up yet. It shouldn't have surprised Toshinori to know that no one had been able to figure it out. Even his protege and successor young Midoriya hadn't believed it when he saw him transform before his very eyes on that fateful day they met, and quite frankly, he couldn't have blamed him. All Might's very presence commanded attention, standing at the full height of 7 feet 2 inches, and that wasn't including his hair, with a voice that's volume was only outmatched by present Nick's shout. He didn't even need to announce, "I am here," for people to know he had arrived, his visage and silhouette instantly recognizable to any and all who knew it. Toshinori Yagi, on the other hand, was not so lucky. While he still retained his incredible height, poor posture often hid that fact from everyone, causing many to think he was in the 6-foot range. It didn't help that without his muscles, Toshinori was just skin on bones and generally unpleasant to look at. Some days he couldn't even bear to look at himself. People often turned their gaze away from him and actively avoided him, some going so far as to change their course to dodge the chance of crossing his path. Even though 5 years had passed since his fight with All for One, he still wasn't quite used to the judgmental stares that were thrown his way and would often shrink under them in a vain attempt to make himself seem smaller. He was incredibly thankful when Principal Nezu's office door came into view and quickly rushed towards it. With a rapid-fire knock, Toshinori's eyes flitted back and forth down the hallway to check for any potential witnesses before he was greeted with a gentle, "Come in," from inside. He opened the door and stepped inside, closing the door behind him and turning to meet Nezu's patient gaze at his desk. The principal sat in his large chair, paws clasped in front of him, a small smile spread across his lips. "I'm so glad you could make it, All Might," Nezu said warmly. He gestured to the seat that sat across from him. "Come, take a seat. We have a lot to discuss, don't we?" Toshinori shuffled over to the seat, clutching his briefcase handle like a lifeline. Even when sitting down and slouched over, he still towered over Nezu's small form, which made him subconsciously shrink further in on himself. He pulled his briefcase into his lap and held it there, unsure what to say. "I hope that you've taken the time to consider my offer," Nezu articulated, his smile unwavering. "I have," Toshinori answered. "Wonderful," Nezu proclaimed, clapping his hands enthusiastically. "So, will you be joining UA's faculty as a teacher, All Might?" Toshinori pursed his lips. "I'm afraid not, Nezu." Nezu's mirth disappeared, surprise overtaking his features. "Oh, why is that?" "I would think that you'd love to teach the next generation of heroes." When Toshinori's expression didn't change, Nezu furrowed his brows. "You look concerned. Tell me what's on your mind." "For starters," Toshinori began, clearing his throat a bit, "what would I be teaching? Something to do with heroics, I presume?" "It makes sense, doesn't it?" Nezu asked. "You have a couple of decades of being a pro under your belt. Surely you have a great amount of wisdom to impart onto them?" "Wisdom," Toshinori repeated, snorting a bit. He blinked and covered his mouth, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I'm sorry I didn't." What I meant was that I don't think that wisdom alone will aid me in teaching. Ah, but your experience is surely an asset, wouldn't you say? Nezu pondered aloud. I'm experienced in pro-hero work, Toshinori clarified, his tone firm, not in teaching. The two are fundamentally different. Nezu frowned. That is true. But you'd be teaching about pro-hero work to the next generation of up-and-coming pros? His smile returned with a small chuckle. I mean, to be taught by the number one hero. I would call that a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Would you truly deny our students that? Toshinori had to hold back a grimace. Aren't you worried that having the symbol of peace on campus would bring undue attention to the school? It won't take long for my presence to be noticed, and it can potentially put a target on the school and, worse, the student body. He held his briefcase closer to him without thought. And that's not even addressing the issue of my time limit. Ah, I see, Nezu acknowledged, smiling sympathetically. How long is your time limit, again? 3 hours? I imagine that would be quite troublesome, especially if training with the students puts your body under strain. Not only that, Toshinori continued, if I'm to teach here at UA, I'd likely be assuming my muscular form while teaching, which would be using up time I might need for an emergency. And even if I teach he clenched his briefcase tighter, unable to hold back his grimace that time. It would be putting an incredible burden on the students to remain silent about my condition. He already had one student to worry about as it was. His successor, young Midoriya, proved that he had only the vaguest idea of what he was doing. The young boy was privy to his injury and time limit, a secret he trusted him with alongside his quirk, when the time finally came to give it to him. Toshinori hated to assume he couldn't trust any of the other students, but having too many people in on it would just be asking for trouble. And that's why I think it's best if Toshinori paused to swallow. Decline your offer? I fear the cons outweigh the pros if the number one hero resided on campus as a faculty member. Nezu remained quiet, his face fixed in contemplation. Although Toshinori had not known Nezu for very long, he knew that at his core, Nezu was a thinker, always searching for new solutions to problems. He had no doubt that his mind was running a mile a minute in order to find a way to convince Toshinori to take up his offer. He was always tenacious that way. While I'm sure you're disappointed, Toshinori said, breaking Nezu out of his stare, I don't wish to cause you or your school any issues. So, while I deeply appreciate the offer, I believe it's in everyone's best interests if I decline. Then, a slow, but knowing smile spread across Nezu's face. You're right, All Might. It would be dangerous to have the number one hero be on campus. Toshinori did not trust that smile. But, Nezu repeated, holding up his index finger, just because All Might can't be a teacher doesn't mean that Mr. Yagi can't. Toshinori couldn't stop himself from blinking with surprise. What? Nezu pointed his finger at his temple. Take a moment to think about it, would you? Instead of coming in as All Might, you come in as Toshinori Yagi, a man with years of experience working at a hero agency. He paused to scratch his chin in thought. Our homeroom teachers already cover the basics of hero training, so perhaps you could teach a class on public relations as a pro instead? But what about the internships and work studies? Toshinori asked. Would I really be needed when your school already offers those programs? Nezu wagged his finger. But there's a lot more to working at an agency than what they see during internships. During internships, they're treated as guests, meant to take notes and shadow their mentors, not to actively participate in hero work. Besides, the students won't be starting their work studies until their second year during summer vacation, remember? That is true, Toshinori admitted, recalling his own work study back when he was a second year, but will it really help them? What kind of work can I give them to prepare them for it? I don't have a syllabus. I don't have any idea how I should cover material with the students. And, sure, I have experience working as a secretary manager at an agency, but anyone can teach about that, can't they? You also have experience running an agency, too, do you not? Nezu questioned. His smile widened when Toshinori didn't immediately protest. I would say that's pretty invaluable to students once they graduate, wouldn't you? Not everyone is like hawks. The students are going to need some guidance in the event they look into starting their own agency upon graduating. Toshinori stared in bewilderment. You think I should teach? He twisted the fabric of his shirt in his hand nervously, untucking it from his pants a bit. Like this? What if I need to leave class because of an emergency? What am I supposed to? Then he coughed, just barely managing to cover it with his fist. Pardon me. Nezu snapped his fingers. There's your excuse right there. In the event you need to step out, you can just say you're feeling under the weather. He leaned forward with that same, unmoving smile, a devious glint in his eyes. Plus, by acting as Mr. Yagi, you wouldn't be pressured to hold your form to maintain appearances, thus, allowing you to reserve your time for hero work. You also wouldn't be bringing attention to the school and risk putting it under the scrutiny of villains. He tilted his head. Does that address all of your concerns? Toshinori's hand didn't release his shirt. But don't you think the students would prefer an actual pro to be their teacher? I can always offer you pointers, Nezu told him simply. I mean, you're hardly the first pro we've had who has worried they weren't qualified for the position. Still, I'm sure that with a guided hand, you'll be ready to teach your first class when the time comes. He spared a glance at the calendar that hung on the wall, depicting a photo of the voice hero, present Mike, mid-shout as he leaped into the air. A speech bubble in yellow, staticky font that simply read, August, burst forth from his mouth. You still have a few months before the entrance exams in February and when classes officially start in April. Young Midoriya jumped to the forefront of Toshinori's mind. How would his added teaching duty affect his ability to guide the young boy? He was already struggling enough as it was trying to make sure that his protege was ready for the exam when the time came, but even so, Toshinori himself had been given more time to prepare his body for one for all before his own mentor gave it to him. She hadn't exactly given him a guide on how to teach a successor of his own, and Gran Torino's methods had been questionable at best, but they were all Toshinori knew. He was too afraid to reach out to the old man. Young Midoriya had a strong heart, but he was sensitive at his core, and Toshinori worried what his instruction would do to his young apprentice. Is there something else on your mind, All Might? Nezu asked, startling him out of his thoughts. It's just the two of us, so feel free to share. Toshinori frowned. I could actually do with some guidance in teaching, Nezu. Nezu's brows shot up. Is that so? Well, I'm happy to be of assistance. Does this mean you'll be joining us at UA? Not exactly, Toshinori answered hesitantly, and Nezu frowned. It's just, earlier this year, I met a young boy who wishes to become a hero, and I took on the task of training him to help him achieve that goal. You have a protege? Nezu breathed, his eyes brightening. Is he planning on trying out for UA? Toshinori couldn't help but smile a bit. It's all he ever talks about. It's his dream school, Nezu. Nezu's eyes practically sparkled. Oh, that's wonderful. If he gets in, you simply must introduce him to me. I'd like to know what kind of a lad he is to catch your eye. You two would get on well, I think, Toshinori told him, and he meant it. He's very smart. He has a notebook he carries around that he calls his hero notebook. That's precious, Nezu observed as if it were a simple fact of life. Toshinori chuckled. It is, isn't it? Then his smile faltered. Well, it's hard to explain, really. He clasped his hands in front of him and looked off to the side. I've been struggling in training him. I want to help him, I do, but sometimes I struggle to know if what I'm doing is really going to prepare him for the entrance exam. What's his quirk? Nezu asked, making Toshinori tense up. The principal tilted his head. Is that part of the issue? Is he having trouble controlling it? Toshinori's mind became a flurry. One for all was a secret to only a select few, Nezu included. Could he tell him that he had chosen a successor outside of his roster? No, he might be too critical about the young boy. Toshinori had to make an excuse. But how was he to explain the issues with a quirk that young Midoriya didn't have yet? He at least knew that with each time the quirk was passed down, it grew in strength, and that due to decades of owning the quirk, its power was sure to have grown exponentially. He wouldn't know just how strong until he passed it on and saw a young Midoriya use it in action, but even then, would all the training they did be able to prepare him for it? How was he supposed to justify a quirk that could potentially cause great injury to him? Then, a light bulb flickered on in Toshinori's head. He's a late bloomer, he answered, and Nezu's brows shot upwards again. He spent most of his childhood thinking he was quirkless. As a result, he didn't gain any counseling for his quirk like some of his peers. Nezu brought a paw to his mouth. Oh dear, that is an issue? That's incredibly rare. Most counselors don't know how to handle a case like that. That's not it, Toshinori continued, making Nezu blink. Because he's a late bloomer, his body isn't adapted to the quirk yet. Activating it could potentially put his body at risk. What kind of a quirk is it? Nezu questioned. Toshinori could just see the wheels spinning in his head, only this time, he wasn't nervous about it. He needed all the help he could get, and who better than a certified genius? It sounds like any emitter type. Toshinori nodded. Correct. It's almost an enhancement sort of quirk. It allows him to stockpile an enormous amount of raw power, which lets him significantly enhance all of his physical abilities to an incredible level. Like your quirk? Nezu inquired. He smiled when Toshinori blinked. Is that why you took a shine to him? You saw a bit of yourself in him, didn't you? Toshinori's cheeks grew warm and he coughed into his hand. Maybe. Nezu chuckled. So, tell me, what exactly are you struggling with at the moment? Is it trying to get him to activate his quirk without hurting himself? Toshinori nodded once again. Yes. I've been trying to help him increase his natural strength and stamina so that when he tries to use his quirk, it doesn't cause his body serious harm. His eyes fell downwards. I don't want him to activate it until I'm sure his body can handle it, but with the entrance exam drawing closer, I worry that all the time I'm spending on increasing his physical strength will cut into time we can use to actually have him practice using it. But if I let him use it now, it could really hurt him, Nezu finished, his expression turning solemn. He closed his eyes in contemplation. I completely understand your concern. You're worried that it could cause irreversible damage to his body if he uses it before he's ready. He let out a small hum of thought. That is a tricky situation. Tell me, how long have you been training him? Since April, Toshinori answered. Nezu frowned. Oh dear. And the entrance exam is in about 6 months. When were you planning on letting him use his quirk? After he finished his training regiment, Toshinori told him, but, since we only had 10 months to work with, I wanted to use every bit of time we had. It sounds like you were going to let him use it on the day of the exam, Nezu observed. When Toshinori didn't answer, the principal frowned. All Might, don't tell me you actually thought about it. That's why I'm asking you about it now, Toshinori said defensively. Then he let out a sigh and closed his eyes. I don't know what I'm doing. But I want to help him, I really do. He has the makings of a great hero inside him, and I'm certain that once he learns to use his quirk, he opened his eyes to face Nezu. But these past 4 months have shown me that I really don't have a solid idea of what a teacher is supposed to do. I lost my own mentor when I was just a student and, well, you know Gran Torino. He's ruthless. And you don't want to push him like he did to you, Nezu offered. He exhaled sharply. Well, this is definitely a complicated issue, isn't it? You have a short amount of time to train the boy, and even if you succeed, there's no guarantee his body will be ready to handle it. He closed his eyes in thought. I must say, you've brought me quite the dilemma, All Might. Toshinori looked down. I know. Listen, I'm sorry if this is burdensome. I know you brought me here to discuss me becoming a teacher, but I truly don't know how to move forward when it comes to this. He wrung his hands together. And if I can't even teach a single boy, how can I teach a whole class? Nezu held up a hand. Now, don't go beating yourself up, All Might. I'm not upset you came to me about this. Quite the opposite, actually. He smiled again. This gives us an idea of where we stand and what we need to do to move forward. You don't have to shoulder everything on your own, you know. He wove his fingers together and propped his elbows on the desk, resting his chin on his hands. Though I have only one condition. Condition? Toshinori repeated. In exchange for my help, Nezu told him, you come take on a spot as a teacher here at you. Just as Toshinori opened his mouth to protest, a single look from Nezu silenced him. Now, like I said before, you wouldn't be acting as All Might, but as Mr. Yagi. And before you start panicking, I'll remind you that I can help you with a syllabus and curriculum for your students." He closed his eyes with a smile. "You won't have to worry about a thing." Toshinori stared helplessly for a moment before he let out a ragged sigh. "I can't talk my way out of this, can I?" Nezu peeked an eye open, revealing that devilish glint. "I'd love to see you try." Toshinori stood still for a long moment, not sure what to say. He would be lying if he said he knew what he was doing with himself half the time. Could he really be a mentor for a whole class when he struggled to draw the line between Gran Torino showing tough love or just being harsh for the sake of being harsh? Could he even draw the line with himself when he still didn't know what he was doing with his own successor? Most days, he would bury himself in whatever work he could to silence the thoughts that plagued his mind, telling him that it wasn't enough, reminding him of how little time he had left, shouting just how pathetic he was. But then young Midoriya came into his life and reminded him of his own values, of what it takes to be a true hero. A young boy without a quirk had done what he struggled to do when he himself felt as helpless and pathetic as he did when he was quirkless. He tried to save someone. He was certain that even without a quirk, young Midoriya would have found a way to become a hero in his own right and prove what he said on that rooftop wrong. Toshinori could only imagine what he could do with the power of One for All, the quirk his own mentor had given him to fulfill his dreams of being a hero. His mentor. It was because of his mentor that Toshinori was able to become All Might, to become the symbol of peace and #1 hero that fought against evil with a smile on his face. Could he put on that same brave smile as Toshinori and give those students what he lost when he was just a teenager himself? A mentor who would give them the power to achieve their dreams? Toshinori's hand lingered over his injured side once again. How much time did he have left after he passed his quirk on to young Midoriya? How long would the embers of the flame that once roared inside of him last under a storm with only himself to shield and protect it? And once those embers were gone, what would he be left with? What good would he be without his power? Would teaching the students of his alma mater allow for him to share his knowledge before his time on Earth ran out? Would it be enough? Was he enough? "I'm not hearing a no," Nezu announced, breaking him out of his thoughts. With a deep breath, Toshinori closed his eyes. "If I say yes, will you really help me with young Midoriya?" "Only if you help my students as well," Nezu told him. "I believe you have the potential to be a great help to their journey to become heroes." He straightened up his posture. "But first we can start with your boy." "My boy," Toshinori mused. The thought brought a small smile to his face. "All right, then," Toshinori conceded. "I'll teach it, Nezu." "Where do we begin?" Nezu grinned. "For starters, I'd like to meet your protege in person and get to know him. It'll give me a sense of what I'm working with." "You want to meet young Midoriya?" Toshinori blurted out. "Of course," Nezu proclaimed. "How can I not? He sounds like a bright young man and I'd love to pick his brain a bit. You can't hoard him all to yourself, you know. He might wind up being a student here yet." Despite himself, Toshinori smiled. "Hopefully, we can turn that mites into something more definitive." "That's the spirit," Nezu cheered. "Now, what's a good time for you two? To come in next week?" Izuka didn't like keeping things from his mother. He didn't have many people he could confide in and his mother knew that, so she made it clear quite often that he could come to her about anything. However, when it came to the secret All Might entrusted him with, he knew that he couldn't share it with her, not yet. While his mentor never explicitly told him to keep it from his mother, he hadn't said to tell her either, so he refrained from doing so. Still, it didn't make it easier on when his mother would catch him by the arm and plant a kiss on his cheek with a gentle statement of, "I love you, stay safe, Izuku," before sending him on his way. As he drew closer to the beach, he clutched the lunch his mother packed for his Sunday workout close to his chest with a heavy sigh. It was a simple box wrapped in a handkerchief patterned in All Might's familiar swoop of blonde hair and white stars amongst red and white stripes. She had made his favorite, Katsudon. It made his heart ache. Should I talk to All Might about it? Then, as if he had been summoned by Izuku's thought, his mentor popped into view in an enthusiastic leap, landing in front of him with a flourish. Standing in his muscular form, he stood over Izuku with his hands on his hips and his dazzling smile spread across his face while dressed in a simple blue tracksuit with white stars adorning the sides. "Good morning, young Midoriya," All Might greeted. He spared the boy a once-over. "I see you're all packed and ready for today's training session." "That's good." "Oh yeah," he stammered, still hugging his mother's lunch. My mom packed it for me." All Might's laugh was warm. "That was nice of her." He clapped a hand onto Izuku's shoulder, making him jump a bit. "Listen, I wanted to talk to you about something before we start in on our training." "Come to the beach." Izuku's stomach dropped. Was All Might reconsidering him as a protege? He thought he had been making good progress during training in the past couple of months, but he supposed it couldn't be helped. He hadn't been especially strong before All Might came along. With a nod, he followed after his mentor, still not letting go of the lunchbox. When the two of them finally got to the beach, All Might took a seat at the bottom step and gestured for Izuku to take a seat beside him. Swallowing nervously, he did so, staring straight down at the sand in fear of meeting All Might's gaze. Then a familiar poof broke his staring contest with the ground and his head snapped to his right to see All Might in his skinny form, coughing into a bony fist. "I'm fine," All Might wheezed, holding up his other hand just as Izuku was prepared to voice his concern. After a moment, he cleared his throat and straightened up a bit. "I want to make it clear that I'm not upset with you, young Midoriya." Izuku's heart dropped. "Why would you be? You're about to crush your lunch from how nervous you are," he observed simply, and Izuku blinked, looking down to see the integrity of his lunch was in jeopardy. Fumbling for a moment, he set the lunchbox down beside him and clasped his hands in front of him, his cheeks warm. "Hey kid, relax, I just said I'm not mad." "So," Izuku drawled out, twiddling his thumbs. "You're not reconsidering me for a successor?" All Might's eyes were soft. "No, my boy, I'm not. I just wanted to let you know that I've sought outside help for your training, is all." Izuku's eyes widened. "What? Oh, you don't have to do that. I mean, we've still got 6 months until the entrance exam, so I'm sure there's time for me to get to where you want me to be. I promise, I've been following your regiment down to a T, but if you're not happy with the results, I can always do more." That was a blatant lie. He had been doing more for a while, but All Might didn't need to know that. "I'm sorry for making you think you need to." "Young Midoriya," All Might interjected, his voice firm, "you haven't done anything wrong. The reason I've asked for help is because..." He turned towards the rising sun. "I fear that I may not be properly preparing you for my quirk." "What?" Izuku blurted out. All Might sighed. "The original plan was to spend the full 10 months bulking your body up so you can handle the quirk upon receiving it. However, that would give us very little time to actually let you practice using it before the exam, and that could be dangerous." He brought a hand to his forehead. "You've lived your whole life without a quirk, so even with the extra bulk up, you're not going to be an expert at using it on day one." "That makes sense," Izuku replied. "I mean, I was born quirkless, so I didn't get any counseling like Kaken did for his quirk, so I guess even with a powerful quirk like yours, I'd be at a bit of a disadvantage experience-wise." He brought a hand to his chin. "You know, no one even really knows what your quirk is. It looks like any emitter type, but since your body undergoes a transformation when it's active, would it also fall under a transformation quirk?" His head perked up and he turned to face All Might with wide eyes. "Am I going to buff up like you?" His mentor let out a raspy laugh. "No, kid, you're not gonna buff up like that. I sure didn't when I got it." Izuku would be lying if he wasn't a bit disappointed to hear that. "Oh, come on, don't look so down." All Might laughed, clapping a hand on his shoulder. Even when skinny, his hands were so large on his body. "You'll be plenty strong with more training, young Midoriya. Besides, big muscles aren't all that, you know." He flexed his other arm with a playful wink. "At least I can fit through doorways this way." A snort escaped Izuku and he clapped his hand over his mouth. "All right, fair enough." All Might squeezed his shoulder. "Now, the reason I sought outside help is so that way I can find the best way to shift your training to let you practice using your quirk safely before the exam. It would be too much of a gamble to wait until the exam to incorporate it into your training. So, when are you going to give me your quirk?" Izuku questioned. A couple months before the exam? I'm not certain, All Might admitted. That's part of the reason why I asked Nezu for help. Izuku arched a brow. Nezu? All Might sighed. He's an associate of mine. I asked him for help the other day and he said he wanted to meet you so he could get an idea of what to do about your quirk. He wants to meet me? Izuku blurted out. His hands started fidgeting again. When are we supposed to meet? What should I wear? Something formal? No, but what if I need to show my physical capabilities? Would a tracksuit be alright? His head perked up. Do they have formal tracksuits, All Might? Should I get one and wear that? You're overthinking it, All Might told him simply, and Izuku's ears grew hot. Just come as you are. No need to put on a show for Nezu, he'd see right through it, anyhow. He's a smart one. Izuku couldn't stop wringing his hands together. Does he know about your secret? All Might shifted uncomfortably. He knows about my injury and my time limit, but as far as he knows, you're a late bloomer who hasn't gained any counseling for his newly manifested quirk. But does he know that I know? Izuku questioned. All Might arched a brow. Does it matter? Izuku pursed his lips. Well, it's just, won't he think it's strange that I know your secret? I mean, I'm just a middle schooler, but I'm in on one of the biggest secrets in the hero world, if you think about it. Won't that worry him? He knows you're my protege, All Might assured him, so it would make sense for you to know about my condition. He waved his hand. Relax, I'll handle the details, young Midoriya. All right, Izuku replied. Then he perked up. You told him I was a late bloomer, right? I did, All Might said. Izuku's brows furrowed. And that I had trouble activating my quirk, right? Yes. So, what are we supposed to do if he asks me to try to activate it? Izuku inquired, making All Might blink. I mean, what do I do? Pretend I can't activate it? Say I'm scared I'll hurt myself? He brought his hand to his chin in thought. If we try to deflect, it might come off as suspicious, but if we try to play along, it could make him even more suspicious. So what do we do? I know you said you wanted to wait until my body could handle it until before you gave me your quirk, but how are we supposed to provide examples about why my quirk isn't working for me if I don't have it yet? Young Midoriya, you're rambling again, All Might noted aloud, and Izuku's ears burned hotter. His mentor offered him a smile and gave his shoulder another reassuring squeeze. Relax, my boy. Nezu already made it clear he's not interested in having you use your quirk right off the bat. He just wants to get to know you before we settle into doing anything strenuous. Izuku's eyes trailed over to the lunch his mother made him. It didn't hit him until then, but this was becoming very real very fast. All Might was truly serious about training him and giving him quirk, to bring him on as a successor. And yet his mother had no idea. How long was he supposed to keep it from her? Until he was given All Might's quirk? How was he supposed to explain that? He very well couldn't say, oh, yeah, I developed a quirk and didn't want to tell you until I got into my dream school. Surprise? How long was he going to keep up the charade? Something else on your mind, young Midoriya? All Might asked, making him jump a bit. When Izuku didn't answer immediately, he squeezed his shoulder again. Talk to me, my boy. With a swallow, Izuku faced him again. It's nothing. Just thinking about stuff, you know? Although his mentor didn't look convinced, he didn't press Izuku, which he was thankful for. Alright. But just remember, you can tell me whatever concerns you have. Nezu and I will be more than happy to offer you help for them. Speaking of, Izuku began, when are we supposed to be meeting him? Oh, All Might piped up, that's right. He actually wanted to talk to you today. Izuku blinked. What? Today? When? All Might stared down at his watch that was styled after his Silver Age hero costume. Was the limited edition one? Would it be weird to ask him where he got it? And then blinked. Would you look at that, he'll be here in about 20 minutes or so. 20 minutes? Izuku repeated. He grasped at his worn, green tracksuit. Should I go home and change? Oh, my hair is probably a mess, I should at least take a brush to it. Relax, I told you not to worry, All Might assured him, just be yourself, alright? Nothing to be nervous about. Just as Izuku was about to ask All Might if he at least had a comb on him, The sound of someone clearing their throat made him freeze. Both he and All Might turned collectively to see a small, stout man with the head of a mouse standing at the top of the stairs. No taller than 3 feet, he wore a white dress shirt with a dark red necktie, as well as a black double-breasted waistcoat and matching dress pants. Strangely, he wore orange lace-up sneakers that looked to be too big for his small frame to complete the ensemble. He held a small case at his side. A smile spread across his face as he faced All Might and Izuku. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," said the man. "Nezu," All Might said simply, and Izuku was certain his heart stopped. "You're early?" Nezu waved a hand. "To be on time is to be late, All Might. I like to be punctual." Then, he turned his attention towards Izuku, which made him freeze. "You must be young Midoriya. All Might has told me great things about you." He turned back to All Might and held up his case. "Is there a place where we can sit and talk, All Might? I brought green tea for us to drink." "That sounds nice, Nezu," All Might affirmed. He stood up and Izuku quickly followed suit thereafter, nearly stumbling before All Might righted him with a single arm. "Would it be all right if we talk at the pier? It'll shade us from the sun while we talk." "What a lovely idea," Nezu replied. He made his way down the steps jovially, his eyes latched onto Izuku. "I'm quite excited to get to know you, my boy. I hope you like green tea, because this brand I bought is simply delectable." Once he reached the bottom step, he paused to stare up at Izuku, which made him tense up in All Might's grasp. "All Might tells me you're planning on trying out for UA in February. I do hope that you get into our fine establishment." "You work at UA?" Izuku blurted out. Nezu laughed. "I do more than that. I'm the principal." Before Izuku could respond, he nodded his head down the beach towards the pier. "Come now, let's get settled down so we can talk." As Nezu started his way down the beach, Izuku slowly turned to face All Might. "Nothing to be nervous about, huh?" "You'll do fine," All Might assured him, offering him a smile. He released him, allowing him to stand upright on his own. "Come now, my boy. We have much to discuss." Despite his anxiety telling him to book it back to his apartment complex, Izuku merely sighed and picked up his mom's lunch to follow after him. He just hoped that he didn't embarrass himself. Midoriya was a shy boy, Nezu observed very quickly. Even when they were sitting down at the seating area at the pier and he had everything set up, the boy had hardly said a thing to him, his eyes fixed onto his teacup. When Nezu poured him a generous amount of tea, Midoriya stammered out a thank you and took a restrained sip, earning a sympathetic smile from All Might. "Young Midoriya is a bit nervous," All Might told him, and Midoriya shrunk further in on himself. "He's a worrier by nature." "All Might," Midoriya whined quietly, clutching his cup tightly. Nezu chuckled. "That's quite all right. But I assure you, there's nothing to be nervous about. This conversation isn't to have any bearing on future enrollment at UA, so you don't have to worry about that." Midoriya didn't appear convinced. "The tea is nice." "It is, isn't it?" Nezu replied, smiling a bit. He set his cup down to bring his paws together in front of him. "So, All Might here tells me you're his protege. I'm curious to know what kind of a boy would catch his eye." Oh, it's nothing really," Midoriya stammered, his eyes flitting towards Nezu briefly before falling back towards his cup. "How we met isn't really that interesting." "Quite the contrary," All Might proclaimed, making Midoriya tense up. Still, the older man took no heed and leaned forward. "You remember that sludge villain attack a couple months back? Young Midoriya and one of his classmates got caught up in the thick of it before I stepped in." Nezu blinked. "Were you the boy who was trapped?" "No," Midoriya answered, his voice small. "That was Kakin. But I saw him out there and I couldn't just watch something bad happen to him, so I started running." He clutched his glass tightly. "I know it was stupid to do in retrospect, but no one else could do anything, so I tried to do at least something." He let out an awkward chuckle. "Too bad throwing my book bag didn't help much." "That must have been very scary," Nezu told him, and Midoriya finally turned to face him. "But you were very brave for doing that." Midoriya snorted. "Not really. I was terrified out of my mind. The only thing that kept me going were my notes from my notebook." Nezu's ears perked up. Is that the hero notebook that All Might told me about? You told him about my notebook? Midoriya blurted out, turning towards All Might with wide eyes. He blinked, then settled back into his seat with an uncomfortable laugh. Sorry, I'm not used to people being interested in it. Some people think it's silly. Nonsense, Nezu told him, which made Midoriya blink again. I'd love to hear more about it. Maybe next time we talk, you can bring it. Midoriya's cheeks turned a shade of pink. I actually have it with me right now, if you want to look at it. He likes to take notes after training, All Might commented with a grin. That's wonderful, Nezu proclaimed with a small clap of his paws. May I see it? The young boy hesitated for a moment, but then reached into his track bag and fished out a tattered-looking notebook. It looked to be burned at the edges and had definitely sustained some water damage, but even so, Nezu could make out the words, Hero Analysis of the Future, Volume 13, written across the subject line. Midoriya set it on the table gingerly and flipped through it briefly, giving Nezu glimpses of what looked to be sketches of some pro-heroes. He finally settled on a page and slid it over to Nezu. These are some of the notes I took, he said a bit shyly, holding the book open with his middle and index fingers so Nezu could read. This is a profile I did on Kamui Woods. Nezu's eyes widened. These notes are very detailed. You even made comparisons to the different types of wood his quirk compares to. His finger trailed across the sketch of him that was labeled his support items and potential weaknesses. Nice job on the sketch too. All Might didn't tell me you were an artist. Midoriya's cheeks turned scarlet. Oh, it's nothing really. I just have a lot of practice from when I was a kid. He ducked into the collar of his tracksuit. I can't draw hands very well. The effort is still evident, Nezu commented, and Midoriya flushed to a darker red. You're very observant. That will serve you well as a hero. Really? Midoriya stammered. He withdrew his hand from the book nervously. Most people think my notes are weird. Nezu exchanged a glance with All Might, who merely shrugged. Well, they were definitely going to have a conversation about that when the boy wasn't present, that was for sure. Instead, he turned his attention back to the notebook and turned a page, revealing a profile over MT Lady. Just like Kamui Wood's profile, it was well detailed and neatly organized, along with some questions written in the margins regarding her abilities and limits. How long have you been doing this? He asked. As long as I can remember, Midoriya answered. It's, actually the 13th volume. I have 12 more back home. Oh, Nezu just had to see those when he got the chance. You're well practiced. I'm a bit of a note fiend myself. Have you considered adding tabs? I have, Midoriya proclaimed excitedly, nearly jumping out of his seat. His cheeks flushed and he settled back down into his chair. Sorry. All Might chuckled. It's quite all right, my boy. Midoriya twiddled his thumbs. I'm not used to people asking me about my notes. I never get to talk about them with anyone. Then, as Nezu turned his attention back to the notebook, he stared at the burns that marred the edges of the book hard. The love and care that went into the notes inside didn't match the destruction brought about on the outside. He couldn't imagine that Midoriya had done that himself. Well, I think they're wonderful. Midoriya practically lit up. You mean that? His expression dropped for a moment. You're not saying that to make fun of me, are you? Of course not. Nezu exclaimed, bringing a paw to his chest in shock. That'd be cruel. I guess it would be, Midoriya murmured, fidgeting with his hands a bit. He stared down at his teacup, though his mind seemed to be miles away. Who on earth hurt this boy? Nezu pondered. All Might cleared his throat, breaking him out of his thoughts. So, Nezu, what exactly did you want to cover with young Midoriya today? I know we're not going to be doing anything physical, but I imagine you had more in mind than tea and small talk. You'd be right, Nezu replied. He turned towards Midoriya, who faced him hesitantly. All Might tells me your quirk is an emitter type that allows you to enhance your abilities by stockpiling power. However, you can't activate it for fear of causing damage to your body since you didn't receive any counseling for it as a child. Is that true? Midoriya gave a slow nod. All Might's been trying to help me bulk up for when I use it, but I haven't had the chance to really practice with it. It's a tricky situation for sure, Nezu admitted. So, what did you have in mind, Nezu? All Might asked. Nezu offered up a kind smile. I was thinking we could ask young Midoriya, actually. Midoriya blinked. I'd like to see what you have to say, Nezu clarified, and the young boy gaped at him. Act as though you're analyzing a pro. What observations would you make? What advice would you give them? His smile spread further. I'd like to see your analysis in action. Oh, you're in for it, All Might teased, which made Midoriya blush again. Don't be shy, Nezu assured him, prodding his notebook back towards him. Go on. I'm sure you have a lot on your mind. He fished a pen out of his breast pocket and offered it to him. Write down anything that you think is important. Midoriya gingerly took the pen from him and flipped to a fresh page. Right. If you insist, he straightened up and cleared his throat. Well, it's like you said before, my body isn't adapted to my quirk yet since it didn't develop with the rest of my body, so it hasn't really matured, so to speak. I have to work harder in order to be strong enough to handle it like a normal person whose quirk developed normally, so I have to exercise and shift my diet to bulk up. When the tip of his pen reached the paper, it practically flew across the lines. But it's a huge risk to activate it even after that point because there's no guarantee that muscle mass alone will be enough to allow my body to handle it, and yet, at the same time, I can't gain any experience with it because I haven't been able to incorporate it into my training. At its core, the main issue is that I can't activate my quirk without training, but without practice, I won't have control over it. The boy paused in his writing to glance at Nezu. That all makes sense so far, doesn't it? It does, Nezu told him, and Midoriya visibly eased up. Go on, my boy. All right, Midoriya began again, bringing his attention back to his notebook. Well, it's also an issue to think about how I'll be able to even move with my quirk activated. If it puts my body under incredible strain, will I be able to dodge or even deliver attacks? Would it also be effective to incorporate combat into my training in the event I'm not able to utilize my quirk? I mean, Eraserhead has a quirk that isn't naturally combative, but he found a way to work as an underground hero by being adept at combat. Strength training is good and all, but is it the only thing we should be thinking about? His head snapped towards All Might, a near-manic glint in his eyes. Could we make an obstacle course out of the trash heap to practice parkour? Nezu spared All Might a faux accusatory look. Where have you been hiding this boy, All Might? I might try to steal him from you. He's a smart one, isn't he? All Might said, reaching over to ruffle the boy's messy green locks. A little too smart for his own good, if you ask me. Midoriya playfully pushed his hand away. You didn't answer my question. An obstacle course, eh? All Might repeated, chuckling a bit. Well, it would certainly repurpose some of those items, that's for sure. But do you think you can compete with the number one hero, kiddo? He ruffled the boy's hair again. Or just maybe you'll leave this old man in the dust? You're not old. Midoriya protested. Nezu cleared his throat, causing them both to look at him. I must say, you made some important observations. They're definitely things to think about. He focused on Midoriya. What notes have you been taking after your training sessions? Midoriya flipped back a couple of pages. Mostly I've been keeping track of what items I've moved and the estimated weight of them, as well as what muscles I was working out when doing so. I've also been detailing the diet All Might planned for me to put in comparison to my calculations in order to better assess where I need to make changes for the next session. Though, one of my main concerns is that because each training session is so different due to the different ways I have to carry and move things to clear out the beach, it's not giving any specific part of my body consistent exercise. I've thought about incorporating other exercises in order to make sure my entire body is exercising the equal amount so that my body is more versatile in its capabilities whenever I'm using my quirk. Realistically, I also can't expect All Might to be present at all times due to his job as the number one hero, so maybe it'd be good if I had other training exercises to do throughout the week whenever we're not training together, but that would also be putting me at risk of overdoing it and have the opposite effect of what we're trying to accomplish, so it's hard to gauge where the middle ground is. Ah, so I see, Nezu affirmed, leaning back a bit. You want to intensify your training without lessening your gains? Midoriya's cheeks turned pink once again. More or less. Sounds so simple when you put it like that. You do bring up an excellent point, young Midoriya, All Might observed, causing the boy to turn to him. I came up with the aim to pass, American dream plan with your current body in mind so that way it was able to handle it. But, you are right in observing that the beach cleanup isn't always consistent. He brought a hand to his chin in thought. The initial reason I chose this place was because Hero's origins lay in doing community service, but perhaps I can adjust the plan to have you do some exercises at home when I'm not here with you. Though, that would also call for some adjustments to your diet. A fine idea, Nezu declared. He took a sip of his now warm tea. I could also get in touch with a nutritionist and fitness trainer in order to give you some second opinions. You do that? Midoriya asked. Nezu nodded. You've brought up some excellent observations. I'll be sure to keep them in mind for when I discuss it with the specialists. Thank you, Midoriya stammered out. Much appreciated, Nezu, All Might added, his smile warm. Your input has been pretty helpful. Nezu smiled. Anytime, All Might. Toshinori's anxieties had been misplaced, he realized. He wasn't sure why he was so worried about Nezu getting to know his protege, but he was quickly proven wrong when young Midoriya showed off his analysis abilities and he just knew the boy had won Nezu over. While Toshinori was sharp in his own right, young Midoriya was smart as a whip for his age, so it was nice to see him connect with someone who also shared a high intellect. It was also nice to see the normally reserved boy brighten up and get to share his notebook with someone who just understood. He knew that young Midoriya didn't get to have that anywhere. As the sun began to rise higher and higher, Toshinori decided to offer Midoriya a day off from training for the day so they would have a fresh start when they reconvened next. Naturally, his protege protested, but when Toshinori assured him it was all right, Midoriya finally relented, offering another thank you and a goodbye to Nezu before gathering his things and leaving with a wave. He and Nezu watched from the top of the steps as the boy jogged back to his home. A smile spread across Toshinori's face even as he grew further away. That went far better than I thought it would, Toshinori mused. Then, as Midoriya finally faded from view, Nezu finally turned towards him. You haven't given him your quirk yet, have you? Toshinori nearly choked. A boy who grew up quirkless and yet somehow managed to develop a quirk not unlike your own later on in life when it's exceedingly rare for such a thing to happen? Nezu continued, his smile never leaving his face. It was a nice cover story, but I'd like to think I'm smart enough not to take it at face value. Nezu, Toshinori tried to say. It was also strange that you suddenly changed your mind on the day you were supposed to meet the successor Sir Night Eye had picked out for you. And how funny is it that it happened on the day of the sludge villain attack where you met young Midoriya? Nezu's eyes glinted knowingly when he gazed at Toshinori. A strange coincidence, wouldn't you say? Iron coated the inside of Toshinori's mouth and he brought a hand to his lips to keep it from spilling out. He tried to think of something, anything to say, but when nothing came to mind, he simply kept his mouth shut. Of course he figured it out, Toshinori thought. Of course he did, why did I think he wouldn't? Relax, Nezu said, breaking him out of his thoughts. He held up a paw. I'm not angry. A bit disappointed, if anything, but only because I thought we could trust each other. You already told me about One for All and that you were looking for a successor. So why lie to me? Toshinori frowned. But I didn't know how you'd react. When I talked to Sasaki about young Midoriya, he flat out told me I was making a mistake. He sighed and brought his hand to his face, his eyes drifting down in shame. I suppose I just didn't want to risk hearing the same thing from you. Nezu's gaze turned sympathetic. And on the day he brought in a potential successor for you, Togata Mirio, if I recall correctly. Bright young lad with a sense of humor. He smiled. He and your boy would get on well. Good God, they would, Toshinori agreed. Still, he knew that Night Eye wouldn't be keen on allowing his top intern anywhere near Midoriya anytime soon. Nezu sighed. Night Eye was always a bit hard-headed about these sorts of things. He probably took it as a personal insult after everything. Toshinori finished, sighing a bit raggedly. He dropped his hand and faced Nezu once again. I apologize for lying. I guess I was just worried that if you knew off the bat that he was my successor, you'd be a bit more critical? Nezu suggested, and Toshinori's shoulders slumped. I understand your concern, but just remember I trust your judgment. His smile returned. And I must say, you picked a bright young lad. He's very intelligent for his age. He is, Toshinori told him, and he meant it, but his true strength lies in his heart. He's got the makings of a great hero in him. Nezu's gaze turned soft. I can understand why you'd want to mentor him, and I'm more than happy to offer you advice for any questions you may have. You're going to need it when you start at UA. Toshinori tried his best not to frown. I forgot about that. Oh, relax. Nezu laughed, waving a paw. You'll do just fine. More than fine, I'm sure. Give yourself some credit, Yagi. He couldn't help but bring a hand to his head. It's going to be strange teaching young Midoriya amongst his peers if he gets into you. Toshinori blinked and his hand clutched his head tighter. Oh, God, I haven't even told him that I'm going to be teaching there yet. Well, he's going to find out eventually, Nezu replied. Best to tell him so he's prepared when classes start. Then he straightened himself up and held his case at his side. Well, I should be heading off now. I have some paperwork to do and I should make a note to get in touch with those specialists for young Midoriya's training. Hope you have a nice Sunday. The same to you, Toshinori responded, offering up a small wave. Then, just as Nezu started to turn, he stopped. You know, I always liked the more clever pros than I did the more strong, flashy ones. While I have no doubt that young Midoriya will be a strong hero with your quirk, he turned back to Toshinori with a smile. It's going to be interesting to see a hero who is both strong and clever. Toshinori returned his smile. Interesting doesn't even come close. Nezu laughed. You're right about that. Well, I'll be on my way. Toshinori offered Nezu another way while he made his way down the path and then paused. He turned towards the section of the beach horizon that was covered in trash, only small increments having been removed due to young Midoriya's hard work. They still had 6 months left before it would come time for his power to be put to the test at UA's rigorous entrance exam, which felt so close yet so far away at the same time. Still, he knew that his protege wasn't one to back down from a challenge and that he would find a way to brave the trials ahead of him with that bright smile of his. Interesting doesn't even come close, Toshinori thought. He's going to be incredible. Izuku's feet were heavy when he managed to make it back to the door to his family's apartment. He had braved a smile for All Might and Nezu as he waved goodbye, but the moment his back was turned towards them, a frown settled across his features for the remainder of his journey home. His mother's lunch was still in his hands, though while light in his grasp, it weighed even heavier on his heart. Meeting All Might had been a dream for him. Then, when his idol offered him the chance to be mentored by him and gain his quirk to become a hero, it was far beyond anything he could ever hope for. He could still recall how light his heart felt on his way back home as he played over All Might's words over and over again. You can become a hero. Then, it all came crashing down when he opened the door to his house and his mother crushed him in a hug. She had just arrived home and caught the news that he had been involved in a villain attack, her words overtaken by sobs as she held him close. All Izuku could do was hug her back and tell her that he was fine while she cried into his shoulder, his heart dropping as reality came crashing down on him. It would be a stretch to say he told her everything going on in his life. She knew he wasn't popular at school and that he didn't have many friends, but she didn't know about the extent of the bullying. He had never wanted to worry her, not when she had bigger things to worry about, like her job and paying bills. Still, whenever she held on to him and checked him for any injuries, Izuku couldn't shake the way his heart clenched any time he found himself biting his tongue. What's worse, he thought, his stomach churning. Lying to my mom or betraying All Might's trust? Both were terrible, Izuku knew. Still, keeping All Might's secret was for the good of everyone, wasn't it? If word got out about his condition and the fact that he could pass on his quirk, it would be disastrous. Still, he hated lying to his mother, and while he hadn't always been truthful, All Might's secret was far bigger than just a white lie about how his notebook ended up in such a state by claiming he had been clumsy. He wanted to tell her the truth, but at what cost? By the time he reached the doorway to his apartment, he felt ill. His mother was inside, he knew, and she was definitely going to ask him why he was back so soon when he was usually gone for the full day with All Might. Would he have it in him to make another excuse? Don't think too hard about it, Izuku told himself, just stay vague and you'll be fine. Then he unlocked the door and stepped inside. Just as he predicted, his mother was home, seated in the living room. She was reading a book, a romance novel, judging from the cover, with a coffee mug resting on a coaster on the table. Izuku quietly closed the door behind him in hopes that she was too engrossed in her novel to pay him any mind, but the moment the door clicked close, her eyes flitted up to glance at him. She did a double take and jumped, nearly dropping her book in the process before pressing it to her chest. "Oh, Izuku!" she exclaimed, breathing in a bit sharply. His mother chuckled nervously and set her book down. "You startled me." "Sorry," Izuku murmured, though he wondered just how much he was apologizing for when he said it. Her expression shifted to worry. "You're back earlier than usual. Is everything all right?" "I need to tell you something," Izuku blurted out. His hand slapped over his mouth the moment he said it, and he stared straight ahead, unable to meet her gaze. "Well, so much for staying vague. Did something happen?" his mother questioned. She was off the couch in an instant, and she took his things from him, setting them aside to better inspect him. "Are you hurt? Was there another villain attack?" "Izuku, I told you to be more careful after what happened with the sludge villain." "I'm sorry," he repeated, cutting his mother off. "I'm sorry." The sludge villain. That had been what started it all. Now, he was stuck standing in his living room with a lie caught in his throat and the truth weighing heavy on his heart. Of course he had said yes to All Might's offer, why wouldn't he have? It was like a dream come true to him to become a protege to the man whose very existence inspired him to become a hero, too. There was nothing else for him to think about, not even his own mother. It didn't hit him until he felt her arms come around him when he got home that afternoon all those months ago that he had made such a big decision without her involvement. His eyes trailed down to the lunch that his mother had set aside and his hand clenched into a tight fist. She brought a hand to his face, causing him to look at her worry-stricken face. "Izuku, what's the matter? You can tell me." "I know," Izuku whispered, his voice ragged. "I know I can tell you. I don't know if I should." "Izuku, did someone hurt you?" she questioned. When he didn't answer, her grip on his shoulders tightened. "Did someone threaten to hurt you?" "Oh, Izuku, honey, please, don't hide something like this from me if it puts you in danger. We can go to the police and they'll—" Izuku shook his head. "It's not that. No one threatened me." It wasn't a lie. Kaken had backed off from the most part, and without him to lead the others, most of his peers left Izuku be. Still, even if they hadn't, it wasn't anything he wasn't used to. "I'm okay, Mom, I promise." "Then what's wrong, sweetheart?" his mother asked. He couldn't help but chuckle, albeit a bit humorlessly. "That's just it, Mom. Nothing is really wrong. Everything is great, actually." A frown settled onto his features and he looked away from her. "But you might not think so." She squeezed his shoulders. "Let's take a seat, sweetheart." Helpless to do otherwise, Izuku did as his mother suggested and took a seat beside her on the couch. He couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze and stared down at his hands that had grown so worn from his training. How long was he going to keep this from her? It was only going to get harder to do so the longer time went on, and by the time he received All Might's quirk, it was going to become practically, if not outright impossible. Still, he knew that All Might's safety would be put in jeopardy if he told her about his condition, which made things only more complicated. "Izuku?" his mother asked, her voice gentle. When he managed to bring his gaze up to meet hers, her eyes were soft and he could feel his resolve start to shake. "Talk to me, honey." Izuku swallowed. "You know how All Might saved me from the sludge villain all those months ago." "Of course I do," his mother replied, a laugh in her voice. "You were so excited when you came home. You even showed me his autograph." "He had, hadn't he?" "Well, I actually got to talk to him after everything calmed down." His mother's eyes widened. "Really? Izuku, that's wonderful. What did you two talk about?" Then her face dropped. "Oh no, honey, did something bad happen?" "No," Izuku exclaimed, far louder than he meant to. He looked down in embarrassment. "I'm sorry. No, nothing bad happened. The opposite, actually." He clasped his hands in front of him tightly. "I actually ran into him earlier that day. He saved me from the sludge villain while I was walking home alone." "You mean that wasn't the first time you were attacked?" His mother shouted. She grabbed a hold of his hands. Izuku, why didn't you tell me? It was kinda the last thing on my mind, to be honest, he answered. Though her grip didn't loosen, I thought no one was going to save me and then, he saved me. And then I followed him and I got to talk to him, Mom. I told him I was quirkless and that I wanted to be a hero one day, and he swallowed hard. He told me it was dangerous to be a pro and that, without a quirk, I couldn't be one. His mother's knuckles turned white. He said what to you? It wasn't anything I didn't already know, Izuku replied, and the fury dropped from her face, but then, when I was walking home, I saw the sludge villain again and he hunched over, unable to meet her gaze. It's my fault it got out again. I distracted All Might and the sludge villain got free because of me. And then it attacked Kaken? Oh, Izuku, his mother lamented, you didn't mean to. I know I didn't, he interjected, his voice weak. His eyes began to sting and he clenched his fists with frustration. I know I didn't mean to, but Kaken got attacked because of me and his vision began to blur. And he looked so scared, Mom. I've never seen him like that. But none of the pros could help because their quirks weren't suited to help and he choked out a sob. I ran out before I knew what I was doing and I threw my notebag at it, but it did nothing. I could barely even slow it down. Izuku would never admit it to anyone, but he had multiple fantasies not unlike that fateful day. Kaken, his childhood friend and tormentor, left prone in the hands of a villain while countless pros were left helpless to stop him. He would imagine that his quirklessness would grant him an advantage of sorts that allowed him to swoop in and knock the villain back, rescuing Kaken from its clutches. He would be greeted by cheers from pros and Kaken would tearfully admit he had been wrong about him being a worthless Deku, making the world become much brighter than it had been before. But that hadn't been what happened. If anything, all that fight with the sludge villain did was show just what a Deku he was in the first place. Then, he croaked, sniffling a bit, All Might came in, and it was just over. He saved me and Kaken like it was nothing and his cheeks grew wet. The pros all yelled at me for being so reckless and Kaken got told he was brave. One of them even asked if he would intern with him if he was going into the hero course. Idiots, his mother muttered, and Izuku was so startled he looked up at her to blink. She seemed to realize what she said and shook her head. Sorry. It just bothers me that a child was attacked by a villain and their first thought was to ask him if he was going to become a hero. I thought pros were supposed to be personable. None of them must have kids. Izuku couldn't help but laugh at that. Well, you're not wrong about that. His mother smiled, but then it faded. Izuku, I'm so sorry that you were scared and that you had to see Katsuki like that. But please don't blame yourself for what happened. Her hand still clutched his. There's no sense in going over the what-ifs and what-might-bes. You'll only drive yourself mad. I know, Izuku acknowledged, sniffling again, but that's not the only thing I wanted to tell you. She blinked. Did something else happen? Yes, Izuku answered, and he felt her tense up, but it's nothing bad, I promise. He faltered. Well, actually, you might not agree, but he swallowed. I ran into All Might again after the villain was put into custody. I was walking home and then he stopped me to tell me that I had been brave for doing what I did and that a true hero's feet carried them before they knew it and that his eyes grew misty and he knew his voice was about to break. Seeing someone like me inspired him. His mother's breath hitched. He said that? Izuku nodded and the tears started to run freely. He told me that I could be a hero, Mom. And that he wanted to train me. He wanted to do what? She exclaimed. His mother grabbed him by the shoulders and stared deep into his teary eyes. He wanted to train you. Izuku, what was he? She sputtered for a moment before she could bring herself to continue. How is he supposed to train you? That's part of why I didn't tell you sooner, Izuku admitted, causing her to blink. He told me something about himself. Something that he doesn't want people to know. And I don't know how much I should tell you because it could be dangerous for him. He held up a hand to silence her. It doesn't put me in danger, Mom. It's just, he's the #1 hero. It's a huge secret. Her gaze didn't lose its resolve. What did he tell you? Izuku inhaled sharply. Mama, I know you don't want to betray his trust, she interjected, squeezing his shoulders a bit, but I need to know what he told you, Izuku. She sighed. Look, if there's a way for you to tell me without betraying his confidence, then that's all right. But if it puts you in danger. It doesn't, he told her firmly. If it does, she stressed, holding him tightly, then I would really rather know about it. Izuku let out a deep breath. All right, I'll tell you about how he plans on training me since. Well, it was gonna be hard to hide it when. When what? She questioned. He's going to give me his quirk, Izuku blurted out before he could stop himself. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers. What? Listen, it's hard to explain, but Izuku swallowed. Apparently he inherited his quirk from someone else and it's been passed down for generations. He said he wants to pass it down to me, Mom. How? His mother began, her voice small. Is that possible? I have no idea, Izuku answered truthfully. When she stared him down, he frowned. I really don't. He just told me that it got stronger with each person it was passed down to and that if I was going to inherit it, I needed to train for it. Her stare didn't break. Is that where you've been going? You've been training with him? Izuku looked down. And all those meals I asked you to make for me were part of his diet plan. Izuku. She breathed. I know. He exclaimed. Trust me, I know. I felt horrible keeping it from you, but I didn't want to tell you because it wasn't my secret to tell. Izuku, his mother repeated, and he didn't even have to look at her to know she was about to cry. You can't keep something like this from me. Not something this big. You should have told me before you agreed to do anything like that. You weren't there to tell, Izuku said quietly. You're 14, she stressed, and his heart ached at her tone. You're so young to be making this sort of decision. Do you even know the full weight of what he has planned for you? Izuku finally brought himself to face her. He made a training plan and has even asked for outside help to make sure that we're doing the best training for me possible. He unclasped his hands and brought them to the hands on his shoulders, slipping them off of him. Gently, he held her hands in between them both and looked her in the eye. And all I know is, this is my only chance of becoming a hero. You don't know that, she tried to say. You told me you wish things could be different for me, he exclaimed, causing her to jump. You said that you wished that things weren't like this. His eyes started to burn and he had to choke back a sob. But now they won't be. All Might is training me and he swallowed hard. I know if I back out of it now, I'll always regret it. He could already see his mother's resolve start to crack, even as she matched his stare. You might get hurt. That's true regardless, he told her, and she bit her lower lip. I'm always at risk of getting hurt, Mom. But with his training and his quirk, I'll actually be able to do something about it. He thought back to Kaken, eyes wide as he tried desperately to scream while the sludge wrapped itself around him. I know what it's like to feel helpless, Mom. That's why I want to make sure no one else feels that way either. His mother pursed her lips as tears sprang to her eyes. Sweetheart, I'm so sorry that you were scared and I'm so sorry you couldn't help Katsuki when he was in danger. She pulled him into a hug and he buried himself in her embrace. I don't want you to feel less than, all right? I know how much All Might means to you, but I don't ever want you to think that him choosing you is the only thing that makes you special. I know, he replied, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. It was so easy to say that everyone was special in their own way and had a role to play in the world, but it was so much harder to believe it when everyone else seemed so much luckier. Kaken had been blessed from birth and knew his worth. Izuku wasn't sure what his worth was at all. I know you want to do this, his mother continued, and I know you want to be a hero. But I can't help but be worried for you, Izuku. Her arms tightened around him. But I also know that this is a rare chance and that it means the world to you. And I know if I stop you, I might never forgive myself for it. Izuku blinked and pulled away to look at her. You mean? I want you to be safe, she told him firmly, still holding him. Then her gaze softened. But I know you, Izuku. You're stubborn and where there's a will, there's a way. I'm sure that even without a quirk, you would have found a way to try to be a hero. She offered up a warblike smile. At least with All Might, you're less likely to go vigilante and end up getting arrested. You know, technically, The vigilante laws only apply to people with quirks, Izuku began. Izuku Midoriya, she cut in, and Izuku went still at her gaze. Sorry, he murmured, his eyes falling from hers. His mother sighed. I know how dangerous pro-hero work is, Izuku, and I really want you to be safe. She squeezed his biceps gently. But I also want you to be happy. So, as long as you keep me in the loop and I know that you're all right, I'll help you. Help. Izuku repeated. She smiled at him. You're going to need someone to keep you on task when All Might's not around, you know. He may be your mentor, but I'm your mother, Izuku. Izuku brightened. You mean you'll? Yes, she cut in, making him Izuku beam. Then she held up a hand. But no more secrets. I know you don't want to betray All Might's trust, but I'm your mother. I have a right to know what's going on with my son. If the symbol of peace has a problem with that, tell him to take it up with me. Izuku snorted at the image of his 5 feet 3 inches, mother scolding All Might, who easily had 2 feet on her. I'll be sure to. I'm not kidding. She stressed, and he couldn't help but snicker. Izuku, I'm serious. If that man tries anything, I will not hesitate to give him a talking to. I don't care if he's the #1 hero, he's still a man. Okay, Mom. He laughed, though he tried to cover it with a hand. I promise I'll send you his way if he does anything, all right? Her expression softened. So, has he given you his quirk yet? No, Izuku answered. He hasn't. He wants to make sure my body can handle it before he does. She blinked. What's that supposed to mean? It gets stronger each time it's passed down, Izuku reminded her, and he's had it for a long time, so when he passes it down to me, it's probably going to be stronger than it was when he got it. Oh dear, his mother said, that is a bit worrisome, Izuku. That's why he's been training me these past couple months, Izuku told her, though her expression didn't change, and he's seeking out help to make sure that I'm getting the right amount of training so I can handle it when I do. Do they know that he's going to pass it down to you? She asked. Izuku shook his head. Oh. They just think I'm a late bloomer whose quirk didn't manifest until now, and the reason I can't use it is because my body didn't develop with a quirk. When she stared at him, he held up his hands. Hey, I'm not the one who came up with it. I just went along with what he said. That's what he said we should say when I try out for you. His mother's eyes practically bugged out of her head. You're trying out for UA? Izuku drawled out. He awkwardly shook his hands in what he hoped came across as a festive manner. Surprise? Oh my God, his mother whispered, her eyes still wide. Oh my God, you're trying out for the same school as Katsuki? Izuku faltered a bit. Yeah, I am, aren't I? Izuku, if you're going to get into UA, you're gonna have to work really hard to get there, she told him. Then, a determined look settled across his mother's face that rivaled that of All Might's. That's why I'm going to help you as best I can. He blinked. Wait, really? How? Give me All Might's meal plan, she told him, and whatever exercises he has planned for you when you're not training together. I'm going to make sure you aren't overworking yourself so that you're ready for when you test for UA. She squeezed his arms again. You are going to get into that school, Izuku. I'll help make sure of it. Izuku chuckled. Geez, Mom, I didn't know you could be so intense. Where do you think you get it from? She teased, reaching over to tickle his chin and make him laugh. As soon as he settled down, she pulled him into another hug, holding him close to her. I just want you to know that you're not alone in this, Izuku. You never are, not as long as I'm here. And you can always come to me about anything. All right? The twisted scar that marred All Might's torso jumped to the forefront of Izuku's mind. He hated that he didn't tell her about it, but he figured that would be too much of a risk on top of everything else he told her. Instead, he opted to hold her closer. All right, he answered finally, burying his face in her shoulder. Then, she pulled back to look at him. So, where exactly have you been going to train? Izuku offered her a smile. Want me to show you after lunch? Asterisk. Inko wasn't sure what she was expecting when Izuku took her down to the Takoba Municipal Beach Park, but it certainly wasn't heaps of trash. She stared in absolute wonder at the sheer amount of junk that littered the sands and stopped to wonder just how long this had been going on for it to have gotten to this point. How had no one done anything about it sooner? You weren't kidding about it being a trash heap, she said finally, not taking her eyes off the beach. Izuku couldn't help but laugh a bit as she stared at the littered sand. All Might says that heroes' origins lie in doing volunteer work and community service. He wanted me to clear up this section of the beach to restore the horizon. Inko turned towards him. He's not asking you to do the whole thing? No, Izuku answered, gesturing down to the rest of the beach. He said it would be too much work before the exam. He doesn't want to push me beyond my limits. Well, that's good at least, she told him. Inko grimaced when she took a step and heard glass shift. Heavens above, this place is a mess. Who's in charge of cleaning this place? Izuku shrugged. I dunno. But at least I'll be able to clear some of it when I'm down here with All Might. It might not be much, but it'll be better than nothing. Well, I wish there were more people who were willing to help, Inko admitted, staring down at the beach. She looked at the piles and piles of trash with a heavy heart. Sometimes I wonder if there's any good people left in the world. Then, her son gave her a smile, that same smile that seemed to brighten even her hardest days. At first, she simply thought his smile to be a reflection of his love for All Might, but now that he was older, she knew better than that. While All Might's smile may have been as bright as the sun, her son's smile was her North Star and source of light in its own right, completely original. Of course there are good people in the world, he said, still smiling softly. Then he turned to the horizon before them both, watching as the sun began to dip down. We just have to be them is all. Inko's hand went to her heart without thought as she looked at him. He seemed to be off in his own world, and for a moment, she wondered what he saw through those eyes of his. Instead of voicing her question, though, she simply smiled. You picked a good one, All Might, she thought, watching her son. You better take good care of him. Then Izuku turned back to her and blinked. Mom, are you crying? Inko touched her cheek and was greeted with wetness. Maybe a bit. He walked over and slipped an arm around her shoulder. Come on, don't do that, you'll start making me cry too. She chuckled and wiped away a tear. Can't help it. I'm just really proud of what you're doing, you know. What we're doing, he told her, and she blinked. You said I wasn't doing this alone, remember? You're a part of this now too, Mum. Izuku laid his head on her shoulder. Though, I don't know if All Might is gonna be cool with you picking up anything from my section, so if you pick anything up, maybe stay out of there. Inko laughed and wrapped an arm around his waist to pull him closer. I'll be sure to, Izuku. Izuku pulled away from her. Are you ready to head back to the house? It's getting kinda hot and I'm pretty sure All Might will get mad if I do anything after he gave me the day off. Sounds like a plan, Inko replied. She gave his arm a squeeze and started leading him back to the steps. As the both of them started their way back to the house, Izuku's words kept replaying in her mind and her eyes threatened to turn misty again. There are good people in this world, she thought. You're proof of that, Izuku. That's why he chose you. Mitsuki really hated how picky an eater Katsuki could be. It made making a grocery list and meal prepping an absolute nightmare to get through, since Katsuki would either loudly complain about the quality of the food or outright refuse to eat it. Despite Masaru's gentle nudges and encouragement to at least try the food, Katsuki would always snap back and Mitsuki would find herself launched into a screaming match with her son at the dinner table as her husband was helpless to do anything to calm either of them down. He better not complain about dinner tonight, she thought, staring down at her list as she walked through the aisles of the supermarket. With the entrance exam to UA coming up, Mitsuki knew she was going to have to give Katsuki a healthy diet to match with his exercises so he'd be in prime condition for the day of the exam. Katsuki was dead set on becoming the first student from his middle school to make it to UA, and as long as she was there, she'd do well to help him achieve his dreams. Mitsuki's heart dropped a bit at the recollection of Izuku. He had wanted to be a hero, too, and she could still recall the early days when he and Katsuki would run around her house together dressed in their little All Might onesies. Even as toddlers, her son and the boy she came to love like a nephew had big dreams of matching up to the symbol of peace, their eyes sparkling with joy and rapt attention anytime All Might's beaming smile graced the TV screen. Then, Inko called her one night after a scheduled doctor's appointment in tears, and Mitsuki found herself holding back tears of her own when her best friend told her Izuku was officially deemed quirkless. He asked me if he could still be a hero, Inko told her, choking back a sob. He asked me if he could still be like All Might. There was nothing wrong with being quirkless, Mitsuki knew. While it was rare now, it was only somewhat uncommon when she was growing up. Several of her own classmates had been quirkless and had made incredible accomplishments without the aid of a quirk. However, she knew that the pro-hero world belonged to those with quirks, and that even the most talented quirkless person would have to work twice as hard to get even half the credit, and that there would be no guarantee that they would last in the long term. Just wanting to be a hero wouldn't be enough to become one. Still, even so, Izuku wasn't deterred. The boy just didn't know when to quit, and Mitsuki had to admit she found it a bit admirable. Despite the challenges the world threw at him, Izuku still found a way to put on a bright smile and be kind. Whenever he would come over, he'd ask Mitsuki and Masaru all sorts of questions about their quirks and scribble down everything he could about them in his notebook. Inko said he was on his 13th iteration now. Mitsuki didn't find her own quirk to be that interesting and certainly not heroic, but she was nonetheless touched when Izuku showed her the entry he made with a picture drawn in her likeness alongside entries of real prose. "He's such a good kid," Mitsuki mused as she began to reach the end of the aisle. "I miss having him over." Just as she was about to make a turn, however, another cart suddenly appeared in her view. She jerked the cart back, a curse readying itself to spring past her lips before she recognized the person pushing the cart in front of her. "Oh, hey Inko," Mitsuki greeted, laughing a bit. "You startled me." Inko blinked in realization and a smile spread across her face as her eyes settled on Mitsuki. "Mitsuki, I wasn't expecting to run into you here." Her smile turned sheepish. "Literally. Sorry about that." Mitsuki chuckled. "It's all right, it happens. I'm happy to see you. Been a hot minute, hasn't it?" "It has," Inko replied, adjusting her cart so she wasn't blocking Mitsuki's way. "I hope I'm not holding you up, though." "Of course not," Mitsuki exclaimed. "Come on, you should shop with me. I still have a couple more stuff I need to get." "What were you getting?" Inko beamed. "I was about to head down to the produce aisle, actually." "So was I," Mitsuki told her. She held up her list with a sigh. "You know how Katsuki is about his veggies, though. If it's not how he wants it, he won't eat it." Inko spared her a sympathetic smile as Mitsuki settled her cart by her side. "He always was a picky eater, right?" Mitsuki groused. She spared a glance at Inko's cart and blinked with surprise at the long list in front of her. "Are you stocking up for winter early?" "Huh?" Inko blurted out. She looked down at the list and blinked in realization. "Oh, that? I'm just trying out some new recipes and stuff to try with Izuku." Mitsuki couldn't help but grin. "Speaking of Izuku, what's he been up to?" "It's been a while since I've seen him." "He's taken up exercising," Inko answered. Her cheeks turned pink and she tucked a lock of hair behind her ear. "I actually decided to join him, so we've both been dieting and exercising together. We plan on taking a walk this afternoon when he's done with his homework." Mitsuki's heart went soft. "Ah, that's so cute. It's sweet that he wants to spend time with you." She frowned. "I can't ever get Katsuki to do anything with me or Masaru. I offered to help him train for UA, but he gets so huffy about it, so I just dropped it." "Maybe he just doesn't do well with an audience," Inko suggested. "He might not be able to focus with someone there." "I'm sure it's nothing personal, Suki." Mitsuki sighed. "I keep telling myself that, but, well, lately it feels like he'd rather be anywhere but home. I try my best to let him know he can come to us about anything, and yet he spends as much time as he can away from us. When he's home, he usually holes himself up in his room and goes to bed early." She clutched the shopping cart tightly. "He got himself into some serious trouble with that sludge villain because he would have rather been out late with friends than come home on time." Mitsuki had been on the train when she got the news notification on her phone. She had been mindlessly flicking past posts when the link to a live feed of a mysterious sludge villain holding a middle school student hostage caught her eye and she clicked on it, only to be left frozen still when she saw Katsuki's face. Mitsuki could only watch in horrified silence as her son struggled to break free from the villain's grasp while the pros on site tried their best to handle the situation, though they were left just as helpless as Mitsuki was on the train miles away from the action. Inko's eyes softened and she put a hand on Mitsuki's arm. "I'm sorry, Mitsuki." That must have really scared you, didn't it? Mitsuki's knuckles turned white. Good. But when Katsuki got home, he wouldn't talk to me or Masaru about it at all and yelled at us when we asked if he was alright. He probably wasn't ready to talk about it, Inko told her. Then her gaze fell from Mitsuki's. Izuku didn't talk to me about it until a few weeks ago. He said he was upset he couldn't do more to help. The image of Izuku running towards the sludge villain flashed to the forefront of Mitsuki's mind. She could still recall how her heart dropped the moment he broke from the crowd and threw his book bag in a vain distraction attempt before he clawed helplessly at the sludge villain with tears streaming down his cheeks. Despite being just a child without a quirk to his name, he had rushed into the epicenter of danger to try to save Katsuki from the villain without a thought. She would be lying. She said she didn't sometimes think about how horrible it could have been if All Might hadn't been able to step in and save both of her boys. He shouldn't feel bad, Mitsuki assured Inko. He was so brave for doing what he did. She snorted. Stupid sure, but brave. I can't believe he came running in like that. He didn't even blink. Inko's smile was soft. He said he wasn't thinking when he did it, but he couldn't just leave Katsuki there. God, he's such a sweet kid, Mitsuki complimented, returning Inko's smile. Katsuki could take a page or two from his book. I wish they'd spend more time with each other. I do too, Inko lamented. Then, a laugh escaped her as they pulled into the dairy section. But I don't know if Katsuki would be interested in picking up trash around the beach when he's so focused on training for Yue. Mitsuki came to a screeching halt. Wait, what? You don't mean Takoba, do you? Inko suddenly turned sheepish. Oh, Izuku was just trying to do some community service, you know? He wants to do his part in whatever ways he can. She shrugged at Mitsuki. You know how he is. But that place is a mess, Mitsuki stressed. He'll be cleaning there for months. And he has been, Inko told her, making Mitsuki blink. I didn't find out about it until he told me a few weeks ago. When I went down there to see what he had been up to, I was shocked at how bad it was. Mitsuki grimaced. And to think we used to take the kids there for summer vacation when they were little. Now it's a dump. She shook her head with a sigh. Are there any good people in the world? Then, Inko smiled, a direct mirror to the smile that Izuku would give. I said the same thing to him when we were down there. And you know what he said to me? Her gaze fell a bit out of focus, as if she were in a different time and place. Of course there are good people in the world. We just have to be them is all. Mitsuki's hand went to her heart without thought. Did he really? He did, Inko confirmed, her voice soft. I started crying at the beach over it. A snort almost escaped Mitsuki. I see where he gets it from. Oh, we're here. Inko announced suddenly, a small laugh bubbling from her throat. She lifted up her shopping list sheepishly. Almost forgot what we were doing for a second there. Mitsuki chuckled. Well, when you try out some of those recipes, be sure to let me know how you and Izuku like them. I might try some of them with Katsuki and Masaru. Sure thing, Inko replied. She reached for a head of lettuce and placed it in her cart. Maybe you and Katsuki can come on a walk with us sometime. Izuku might like having someone to race while he's running laps. That sounds like a great idea. Mitsuki agreed. It had been such a long time since the four of them had been able to do any sort of mother-son activities, and her heart swelled at the thought of getting to do it again. I missed seeing Izuku's little freckles. And he missed coming over, Inko told her, still smiling. She sighed a bit wistfully. It's crazy to think how much has changed, you know? Our boys are growing up. Mitsuki's smile turned bittersweet. They really are. It's crazy to think that Katsuki is trying out for Yue already. It seems like just yesterday he was in elementary school talking about doing that. It does, doesn't it? Inko affirmed. I'm so proud of him. I can't wait to see how he does. She beamed. Hopefully the boys will be able to see more of each other in the future. Just like old times. Old times. The days where Izuku and Katsuki would race each other around and try to declare themselves the next number one before devolving into a game of playful wrestling that Masaru would have to break up before Katsuki started pulling out his explosions. The days where Izuku would come to their house and exchange hero names with Katsuki, most of which were direct allusions to All Might's name. The days where Katsuki wouldn't shrug away from her hugs or roll his eyes any time she tried to talk to him. I'd really like that, Mitsuki answered, smiling softly. I'll be sure to ask him about it when we get home. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. The moment that Katsuki heard the front door open from inside his room, he grimaced. He knew it would only be a matter of time before his mom got back from grocery shopping, but he at least hoped he would have been done with his homework and been able to relax for a little before she got back. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes, praying she wouldn't call for him to come down. Katsuki, his mother exclaimed, and he winced at the sound of her voice. Can you come down? I need help putting up the groceries. Katsuki dropped his pencil with a huff and stood up from his desk, pushing his chair back unceremoniously. He tried not to stomp as he made his way down, knowing his mother would snap at him for it, though he couldn't help but clench his fists at his side. As soon as he made it to the entrance of the kitchen, he was greeted to the sight of dozens of grocery bags and he had to try his best not to growl. She knew that he liked to do his homework and study in the afternoon, and yet she insisted on making him waste his time putting up groceries because she didn't have any self-control when it came to shopping. Katsuki, she called again, and his whole body tensed up. I'm right here, he ground out, his nails digging into his palms. What do you need me to put up? His mother greeted him with a frown, but she didn't scold him. I got some stuff for dinner and to prepare your lunches. I know you gotta stick to a diet for your exercise regimen, so I went ahead and got some good stuff to help you stock up on protein and nutrients. You didn't get any broccoli, did you? Katsuki questioned. She rolled her eyes, which is something she constantly got onto him for doing, but was somehow alright when she did it. No, Katsuki, I didn't get any broccoli. You've made that very clear in the past. Because you kept making me eat it even after I told you how much I hate it, Katsuki thought to himself, though he didn't dare say that out loud. He could viscerally recall one night when she screamed at him over eating everything on his plate but his broccoli and told him he couldn't leave the table until he finished it. Stupid Deku had been over for dinner and offered to eat them since Katsuki didn't want them, but his mother told him that it was all right and he could go ahead and have dessert. Katsuki sat sulking with tears in his eyes while Deku had the nerve to look sad while eating an all-might popsicle as his mother continued to berate him for not wanting to eat a meal she'd slaved over like a spoiled little brat. I ran into Inko today, his mother told him, breaking him out of his thoughts. She asked about you. Despite his annoyance, Katsuki softened a bit at the mention of Auntie Inko. He always liked going over to her house, even when Deku would get on his nerves. Their apartment may not have been as nice as his parents' home, and Deku may not have had as many cool toys, but Inko was nice to be around. She didn't force him to hug her, even though she gave really good hugs, and she never made him meals he didn't like. Once she found out he didn't like broccoli, she took the time to pick it out of any meals she made for him and would apologize profusely if he found even a trace of it in his food. If he wasn't able to finish a meal, she'd always smile and put it up for him to finish later, if he wanted. What did she ask about? Katsuki inquired, starting to take some snack boxes out of one of the grocery bags. His mother shrugged. She just wanted to see how you were doing and I told her you were training hard for UA. She says she's proud of you. Katsuki would never admit to it, but his heart swelled. That all? No, actually, Mitsuki replied, and he looked up to face her. She told me that she and Izuku have started exercising together. She smiled at him. She invited us to join them for a walk. Maybe you and Izuku could race each other. Katsuki's hands froze on the snack box. What? His mother blinked, but then immediately frowned. I never said we'd do it, just that I'd ask you about it. If you don't want to, that's fine. She pulled out a head of lettuce with a huff. Don't need to snap at me like that. Why do you keep trying to make me and that damned nerd hang out? Katsuki snapped before he could stop himself. The moment his mother turned back towards him, he immediately regretted it. God, why did she have to come home so early? I was just trying to do something I thought you might enjoy, his mother retorted, putting the lettuce down a bit too roughly. She pulled out a bag of asparagus next and Katsuki had to grip the counter to keep himself from just turning and storming away from her. It'd only make her even angrier. I don't get what your problem with Izuku is, anyway. He's a good kid. You could really learn something from him. He grit his teeth. There she went again, acting like that stupid Deku was better than him. That pathetic weakling was quirkless and had the nerve to act like he was somehow on the same level as Katsuki. And now, apparently, he was out exercising and training to make up for the shitty hand he was dealt with. You just like him because he does everything you say, Katsuki snarled, and he could feel the sweat on his palms threaten to spark. She still had a copy of that stupid entry page from that stupid notebook that stupid Deku carried around printed out and hung up in her office while Katsuki's own creations sat on their fridge away from the view of others before he threw them all away a few years later. Katsuki wished he had burned that volume when he had the chance. You've always liked him more. His mother's hand slammed down onto the counter. Because he's not a selfish little brat like you? Katsuki found the resolve to release the counter. I'm going back to my room. I still need to finish my homework. Don't you dare walk away from me, his mother shouted at his back as he turned. Katsuki picked up the pace as much as he could without running. He wouldn't give her that sort of satisfaction of letting her know that she got to him. We're not done talking. Yeah, we are, Katsuki exclaimed, rounding the corner to go down the hallway. As soon as he was out of her view for just a few precious seconds, he booked it down to his room and slammed the door, foregoing his anxiety about how she'd react. He locked the door behind him and pressed his full weight against the door, holding his breath as he heard her thunder down the hall. He forced himself to stand still when her fist pounded against the door. Katsuki Bakugo, you come out right this instant, his mother screamed. You don't get to walk away. Like hell I don't. Katsuki shot back, hoping his voice wasn't shaking. He knew that if he gave any indication that he was upset, it could go either one of two ways. His mother would take it as a personal affront to her character, which would cause her to lash out, or she'd break down crying over it and make it all about her, dumping her emotions onto him in a heap that would only leave them both exhausted and tired. He'd never get a word in about how he was feeling, not without making her even more upset. His mother let out a loud growl. You're impossible. As she stormed down the hallway, Katsuki didn't allow himself to slump against the door until he couldn't hear her footfalls. His eyes started to burn and he wanted to scream at how he could let himself get so weak over something so small. Why couldn't he have just kept his mouth shut? Why did he let himself get so angry? Why couldn't he just put the groceries up and go back to his room so his mom could make dinner and leave him alone? Stupid fucking Deku, Katsuki muttered, sinking down low to the ground. If that stupid idiot hadn't been so insistent on acting like he was somehow better than Katsuki, then the hag would have never tried to make him hang out with him. He even had the nerve to come running in and try to save him, like there was something he could do when it took all might for Katsuki to be properly rescued. They were leagues apart from each other, and yet he wanted to drag Katsuki down all the way down to his level to make himself feel better about himself, offering him help to suit that stupid little savior complex of his. Why did he insist on trying to copy Katsuki and undermine everything he did? Why did he want so badly to be a hero when it was just a pipe dream for someone like him? And why, despite all of that, did his mother want Katsuki to be anything like him? Once I get into you, I'll show him, Katsuki thought, I'll show them all. As soon as training picked back up, Izuku was given little reprieve before diving right back into clearing out his section of the beach. All Might had also stayed true to his word in shifting his training plan and gave Izuku a copy of exercises and dietary restrictions for him to keep in practice while he was at home, which his mother was elated to receive when he returned home from his grueling training session. Izuku couldn't help but grin at how excited his mother was when he helped her in the kitchen to make the meals. We can be diet and exercise buddies, his mother proclaimed. I may not be trying to be the next #1 hero, but I can still try to be the #1 mom. You already are, Izuku had told her, and then he laughed when she flushed. Still, he couldn't quite push past the guilt in his gut anytime he was reminded that All Might wasn't privy to his mother's involvement. When All Might asked how his mother was so quick to jump on board with the diet plan, Izuku just muttered that she wanted to join him in dieting and exercising, which wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. All Might's positive reaction only made his guilt burrow deeper into his chest, and he wanted the world to swallow him whole so he wouldn't have to face it. He supposed it was what he deserved for keeping the full truth away from his mother about All Might's condition. That, and the fact that All Might was working him pretty hard during training proved to be enough karmic justice as it was. Nice job, sweetie, his mother proclaimed as he tossed the tire onto the stack. She stood a few feet from him in a pink tracksuit and matching baseball, a clipboard in her hands. "You're doing wonderful." His mother did well to keep him on task, at least. She wasn't able to keep up with him at times, but that didn't deter her from supporting him the best she could. Whenever she wasn't doing exercises alongside him while they watched a program together, she would help him keep track of how many reps he had done when he lost count, which was often, and would time his runs around the block. Despite the ache in his lungs, getting to see his mother brighten up any time he broke one of his records made it all absolutely worth it. While he somewhat hated that no one else could see the kind of progress he was making, having his mother there to cheer him on felt better than any crowd of people put together, and he wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. The only downside was that he was still in school, which Izuku honestly considered to be more egregious than any training that All Might could possibly put him through. Even without Kaken there to rally people against him, his academic journey didn't exactly run smoothly with other classmates to occupy Kaken's role as antagonizers, though Izuku certainly preferred their ribbing over anything Kaken could potentially throw at him, literally. All Izuku could do was duck his head down and try to keep a low profile until the weekends and, eventually, the entrance exam. Just a couple more months, Izuku told himself as he hauled another tire over his shoulder. Then, just as he was getting ready to pick up a discarded microwave sitting atop a lopsided armchair, she caught him by the shoulder. "Hold up there," his mother told him, her grip surprisingly firm enough to bring Izuku to a full stop. "It's break time. Time for you to eat?" Izuku blinked. "Already? It doesn't feel that late." As if on cue, his stomach growled loudly for them both to hear. His mother chuckled and Izuku's ears grew hot. "Your stomach begs to differ. Come on, let's take a seat." Izuku and his mother took their usual seat down at the bottom of the steps and pulled out their packed lunches to eat. They had identical meals, both of which were wrapped in All Might-themed cloth, Izuku's being inspired by his costume from the Silver Age and hers being dotted with little stars and stripes. No time was wasted in unwrapping their bento boxes, and Izuku dug right in, forgoing manners to fill his empty stomach. "Slow down, Izuku," his mother chided with a laugh. "You'll make yourself too sick to work." Izuku came to a still and sheepishly smiled. "Sorry." She reached over to ruffle his hair. "Oh, don't be like that. Just slow down and enjoy your meal. We still have the rest of the day to finish up." Izuku tried his best to suppress a frown. While it was true that he had made an incredible amount of progress in clearing out the section of the beach All Might assigned for him to clean and was nearly done with a couple months to spare, it still bothered him to see the beach in such a state of disarray. He knew that All Might wouldn't want him to push himself, however, and that his mother would likely yell at him for putting his body under such strain when he was already training heavily. "Do you think I'll finish in time for the exam?" Izuku asked her after taking another bite of his lunch. His mother nodded. "Without a doubt. You've been making an incredible amount of progress." Izuku couldn't help but stare at the mountains of trash in front of them both. While he knew deep down that trying to clear the whole beach by himself would probably prove too much for his body, he would be lying if he said that he didn't sometimes sneak some stuff from outside his assigned section to the pile for transport. "If only I had more time," he thought, frowning a bit. His mother's hand fell onto his shoulder, nearly making him jump out of his skin. "I know you want to do more, sweetie. But now's not the time for you to be getting ahead of yourself. You gotta stay on track." Izuku sighed. "Yeah, I know." "Oh, don't worry, Izuku," his mother assured him with a smile. "There will be plenty of opportunities for you to come back and finish the beach cleanup down the line. You can't rush that sort of progress, especially by yourself." Then she gasped and clapped her hands together excitedly. "Maybe we could organize a beach cleanup crew and get other people involved." Izuku chuckled. It would be nice to have an extra pair of hands with the other sections. Still, Izuku couldn't quite erase the voice in the back of his mind that was telling him he wasn't doing enough. If he was really going to inherit a quirk as powerful as All Might's, then shouldn't he be working himself a bit harder? He already knew that his body was going to struggle to handle the power when he got it, but surely there was something he could do to make sure it wasn't such a shock to the system. Even with All Might's adjusted diet and exercise plan, there wasn't a guarantee that he would be ready to inherit All Might's power when the time eventually came for it. What exactly was going to happen when he tried to use his quirk for the first time? Would his limbs really shoot off his body, or was that an exaggeration made by All Might? Just what exactly? Izuku, honey, you're mumbling, his mother cut in gently. Izuku slapped his hand over his mouth, nearly dropping his chopsticks in the process. As a hot wave of embarrassment washed over his cheeks, his mother squeezed his shoulder with a giggle. Sweetie, I know you're worried, she told him, but you're the one who told me to trust All Might with his training for you, remember? I suggest you do the same too. Izuku's hand fell from his face. I know, but… Izuku, his mother interjected, her voice firm, but not unkind, you have to remember that this is all a part of the process. You're not going to get where you need to overnight. Turned towards the section that Izuku had been clearing out. I mean, just look at what you've done here in just a few months. I can't imagine how bad it looked before. It was pretty bad, Izuku conceded. He shuddered a bit. There was a fridge that was deadbolt shut by chains that All Might and I couldn't get open that we're pretty sure had something that used to be alive in there. His mother's face scrunched up a bit, but she decided not to dwell on it. The point I'm trying to make is that you're not going to reach the end goal right away. This is a marathon, not a sprint. She gave his shoulder another squeeze. Just take it a little at a time. 1 foot after the other and you'll get there in due time. 1 foot after the other, Izuku repeated to himself. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. He knew that she was right. All Might hadn't made his hero debut until he had already graduated from UA, and even then, he was still figuring some things out and had to build himself up from the ground up like any other hero. Meanwhile, Izuku hadn't even started his first year or even had one for all yet. He still had a ways to go before he'd make it to his end goal. Just remember you're not doing this alone, his mother told him. She slid her arm around his shoulders in a hug. I'll be right here to cheer you on when you're still figuring this stuff out. Izuku smiled. Thanks, Mo. I'm really happy you're out here with me. She released him. Now, let's finish our lunch so you can start back up again. We gotta be ready for whatever All Might has planned for his lessons. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Toshinori had no idea what he had planned for his lessons. Trying to come up with a curriculum to teach at UA was much easier said than done, even with Nezu's assistance on the matter. The two of them had put aside time on select afternoons to meet up and discuss potential plans for the upcoming semester, from grading scales to assignments that could potentially coincide with other projects going on in the students' other classes. Nezu had a plethora of ideas to include, which was both a blessing and a curse, as it made it hard to choose which ones would make the cut for the final plan. Alright, so how do we feel about the sports festival evaluation project? Nezu asked him. He held up a makeshift rubric he made, his writing a pristine print. The students could watch the festival and write about which students they would choose for their own agency and why. It might also give students some feedback on what they might need to change or work on. Toshinori arched a brow. That's an interesting idea. Though, would students be alright with having to take notes for an assignment during a school event? Nezu waved a hand. Oh, I'm sure it'll be fine. Besides, it'll be a good way to make sure students pay mind to their classmates and what they're capable of. Being a pro does involve working with others and seeing how you might fit together, after all. That's true, Toshinori replied. The corner of his lip quirked up a bit. If young Midoriya gets in, he'd have a field day with that assignment. He would, Nezu agreed, chuckling a bit. I imagine he'd have notes on every single one of his classmates. Toshinori let out a small chuckle himself. He's observant, that's for sure. Nezu smiled. Speaking of, how is he faring under our new training program? Is he making great progress? Instantly, Toshinori felt his smile drop. While it was true that his successor had been doing an incredible job with his training and was well on his way to meeting the goals that Toshinori set out for him, the joy that Toshinori thought he would feel was instead occupied by dread. Is something the matter? Nezu asked, stirring him out of his thoughts. Has young Midoriya been struggling? Toshinori let out a sigh. No. Quite the opposite, actually. Nezu tilted his head curiously. You seem worried. What's on your mind? Toshinori began, trying to find the words to say, it's complicated. Young Midoriya is getting closer and closer to finishing his section of the beach, and he's been staying on top of his exercises, But, you don't think he's ready yet? Nezu guessed. Toshinori shook his head. No, I don't think I'm ready yet. Despite the swell of pride in his chest at the initiative his successor was showing, he faltered as he realized that would mean young Midoriya would receive his quirk and they would begin training on One for All. He had his diet and exercise regimen for young Midoriya down to heart, and he knew logistically speaking what the next steps were supposed to be when it came to training him, but that didn't mean that he was necessarily ready for when they got to those next steps, or that he even had a clear vision in mind for how he would go about teaching his successor. It'll only be a matter of time before he's finished with his section of the beach, Toshinori thought to himself. He was certain that if he had a full stomach, it would be churning at the very thought. He wanted to believe that Midoriya would be ready to begin training on his new quirk, but Toshinori knew from experience that the months of training that went into training his body wouldn't necessarily factor into his first day with One for All. Setting a solid foundation didn't mean that young Midoriya would be able to stick the landing right off the bat. Ah, I see, Nezu said finally. You're worried that you won't be preparing him for how to use your quirk properly, are you? Toshinori sighed. I know he'll find his way. He's a tenacious young boy and he's already proven his merit, but... He clasped his hands in front of him anxiously. What if he hurts himself, Nezu? What if I tell him to do the wrong thing and it ends up causing irreparable damage to him? Your quirk is very powerful, Nezu affirmed, his brows furrowing, and we still don't know just how strong it'll be once you finally pass it down to young Midoriya. Trial and error is to be expected, but it would be good to minimize the likelihood of such errors having a lasting negative impact. He reached for his teacup and gave it a stir. Tell me, how did you fare when you received your quirk? Very well, actually, Toshinori answered. I didn't really struggle with it at all. It came pretty natural to me. Toshinori had been lucky. After fumbling a bit, he took to One for All rather quickly. The quirk felt like an extension of himself, and his ability to manipulate it was intuitive, even at the beginning. His mentor had barely needed to give him instruction on how to use it before he got the hang of it, and he only needed small adjustments for how he used it, which had been wonderful for him when he was a student. Now, decades later, he had nothing to fall back on to use for when he became a teacher himself, his own mentor's words giving him little to pass on to young Midoriya. I wish I could talk to her, Toshinori mused, his frown deepening. Even when Gran Torino took over his training after he lost his mentor, everything that Toshinori learned with him always circled back to what he learned with his late mentor. Gran Torino's training was more focused on increasing strength and stamina so that he could effectively attack and defend against opponents while using One for All, his attack drills becoming pure muscle memory to Toshinori that he slipped into without thought. Still, he couldn't imagine doing the same process with young Midoriya, especially so early in his training when they weren't certain how his body could handle the quirk. I see, Nezu commented. He brought his cup to his lips and took a small sip. So, you're worried that if Midoriya faces any complications you won't be prepared to handle them due to not having first-hand experience with it? Yes, Toshinori replied. I fear I won't be able to provide any meaningful feedback for him to incorporate into his training. He let out a sigh. And I can't exactly ask my mentor for advice on the matter, either. Nezu tilted his head. What about Gran Torino? Maybe he could give you some tips. Instantly, Toshinori's entire body tensed up. But that might not be a good idea. Ah? Scared he'll run your boy off? Nezu teased. He chuckled and set his cup down on the table. Understandable. It might be a bit too soon to ask for his input when Midoriya has only just begun his journey. So what do I do then? Toshinori questioned. He brought a hand to his face with a ragged sigh. I've only ever been the student, not the teacher, and that was decades ago. How am I supposed to teach him like my mentor did me? His eyes fell down to the sheets of paper covered in curriculum plans and he grimaced. How am I supposed to teach a whole class if I can't handle one student? Nezu offered him a kind smile. I know you don't like to worry, All Might. But the fact that you're worried means that you care, and that's invaluable to a teacher. He leaned forward and placed his chin on his interlocked paws. And judging from how you speak of your mentor, it seems like she cared an awful lot too, didn't she? Despite his anxiety, Toshinori smiled. She did? She cared so much? Then his frown returned. But she also seemed to know what she was doing more than I do now. When I was with her, everything just made sense. Anytime I had a question, she seemed to know just what to say to get me to understand it. Did she always have it right off the bat? Nezu asked. Well, Toshinori drawled. No, but if I didn't get it, she'd say it in a way that made sense. So, she adjusted her way of teaching to suit you, Nezu confirmed. Toshinori arched his brow. What's your point? Nezu smiled knowingly. The best teachers know when and how to adapt, All Might. Sticking to one method isn't always going to cut it and can sometimes slow progress. The reason why you were able to take to your mentor's training so quickly is because she was able to mold her teaching to you, not vice versa. That glint still shone in his eyes. How do you think young Midoriya would like to learn from you? A snort escaped Toshinori. He'd probably like to hear every single thing I could possibly tell him so he could write it all down. So why not tell him then? Nezu replied. Toshinori blinked. What? If he processes information better by writing it down, then let him, Nezu told him. He's a very smart boy, All Might. You'd be doing him a disservice not to let him use that to his fullest capability. As long as he isn't pettifogging, it'll be good to take the time to answer whatever questions he may have. Pettifogging? Toshinori repeated. Focusing on petty details, Nezu clarified, but it's also important to remember that sometimes, the devil is in the details. He'll do much better with the full picture of what he's working with in mind. He perked up with a small gasp. Oh, maybe you could let him do an in-depth profile on you and your quirk. He'd love that. He would, wouldn't he? Toshinori murmured, chuckling a bit. Nezu gave him a warm smile. Just remember, All Might. I'm here to help you if you ever need it. Don't be afraid to come to me about any concerns you have with young Midoriya. He picked up his teacup and took another sip. Now, how about we get back to getting a handle on your first semester's curriculum? As Nezu began to rummage through the papers, Toshinori's mind kept replaying his advice. It sounded so simple when Nezu said it, and yet, Toshinori couldn't help but feel inadequate. He was the #1 hero and symbol of peace, the 8th in line of holders to One for All, but despite all of that he struggled to teach his own successor. The power of One for All was not something to be taken lightly, and while the responsibility associated with it had lessened significantly in light of All for One's demise, that didn't make the task of teaching a successor any less daunting. He could only hope that young Midoriya wouldn't ever have to face a villain like the one who he and his predecessors had fought against for generations. There's still so much he doesn't know, Toshinori thought. His hand came to his injured side and his fingers curled around the fabric of his shirt. But what good would telling him of All for One do? He didn't remember much from his fight with All for One. When he stepped up against the man who took his mentor and the predecessors before her from the world, he tried his best not to let emotions get the better of him. However, he underestimated the levels of low his opponent would stoop to in order to defeat him, and before he knew it, he found himself in the fight of his life. Everything that came before fell completely dark in the wake of the devastating blow that left him on the brink of death, his only clear memory of the being the end. Despite how much Toshinori hated All for One for what he had done, he hated him the most for forcing him to commit such an act to end their fight. So, did you have any questions about the curriculum? Nezu questioned, startling Toshinori out of his thoughts. He peered at Toshinori with his head tilted curiously. I feel like this is a solid start for your first semester here at UA. Trying his best to quiet the storm in his head, Toshinori put on a smile. Sure. Would you like to look at the second semester? As the two of them continued to brainstorm and sort the curriculum out, Toshinori found himself circling back to his previous concerns. Would he really be able to adjust his teaching style to suit Midoriya and aid him in his journey to mastering One for All? Would he be able to navigate the potential errors that come with the young boy's trial run of the quirk? And would he be able to handle the responsibility of teaching him while working at UA? There's a lot I have to tell him, Toshinori thought. If only I knew where to begin. Izuku wasn't sure how he was supposed to feel when he finally cleared out his section of the beach. With each day bringing him closer and closer to meeting his goal, he supposed he should have felt some form of gratification or at least a sense of accomplishment, especially when he had managed to do it with a couple months to spare before the exam. Instead, as he stood amongst the cleared horizon and faced the setting sun, he couldn't quite put a word to what he was feeling. "Well done, young Midoriya," All Might told him, breaking him out of his thoughts. His piercing blue eyes shone with pride as he gazed at Izuku's sweaty face. "You restored the horizon for the whole section." Despite his exhaustion, Izuku managed a smile. "I can't believe I did it. I thought it'd take me much longer." All Might chuckled. "Well, it's a good thing you finished up in time for the exam. That gives us more time to focus on training you once I give you my quirk." Izuku should have felt excited. Every single day he was clearing out his section of the beach or he was working out with his mom. The one constant that helped him to push through the pain and exhaustion was the fact that it would all lead to All Might giving him his quirk. He always figured that once the day finally came, he'd be jumping for joy or crying out of sheer gratitude, and yet, his eyes trailed over to the hills and valleys of trash that still littered the beach. He pursed his lips and clenched his fists. Did I really earn it? All Might's hand fell onto his shoulder, making him jump. "I know what you're thinking, young Midoriya. But I assigned you only this small section because I knew that was what your body could handle at this point in time." All Might turned to the piles of trash with furrowed brows. "Clearing out the whole beach would be too much for you." Although he knew it was true, it didn't make it easier to accept. "Yeah, I guess." "Relax, my boy," All Might assured him, smiling a bit. "You've done amazing work here these past few months. And just think, once you get the hang of one for all, the rest will come easy to you." Then, it hit Izuku all at once. "Wait, so does that mean?" "Congratulations," All Might told him. He clapped his hands together and beamed at Izuku. "You've finally reached the end of this phase of training. That means you can graduate to the next one." "You mean," Izuku began, stopping to swallow. "You mean you're going to give me your quirk? Have I really earned it?" He felt his eyes start to burn and he tried to blink back the tears that he knew were coming. "You've done so much to help me. How did I get so lucky?" All Might's eyes were soft as he gazed down at Izuku. "My boy, it was your hard work down here that did this, not mine. That's why I wanted to reward you properly." Then, to Izuku's total surprise, his teacher pulled a small wrapped box out of his large jacket. The paper was a deep blue adorned with stars and red stripes. A bright, golden bow rested on the top of it. A tag hung from one of the loops of the bow and there Izuku saw his own name written on it in neat script. "Surprise!" All Might proclaimed, and Izuku jumped when he took on his muscle form. "I wanted to get you something to commemorate today." Izuku did his best to choke back a sob. "Why, you didn't have to?" "Nonsense," All Might told him. He held the present out to Izuku. "Why don't you open it up?" With shaking hands, Izuku took the gift from All Might. He gingerly removed the bow and wrapping paper, some part of him too afraid to see what was inside. Despite knowing All Might wouldn't do such a thing, he couldn't help but feel like this was all some cosmic joke and that when he opened the gift, he would be greeted with something to confirm his worst fears. It wouldn't be the first time he had gotten a joke gift from someone and become a laughingstock for assuming someone cared enough to get him a present. However, as soon as Izuku's fingers broke past the paper, his breath hitched. "Is this?" Izuku questioned, the words escaping him. As soon as the rest of the wrapping paper fell away, his eyes widened and his jaw dropped. Laying in his hands was a brand new notebook, the pages crisp and pristine beneath his touch. The emerald green cover was sturdier than the campus notebooks he used in the past and already had black text etched across the surface. Hero Analysis of the Future, Volume 14. "I know you already have your other notebooks," All Might acknowledged, "but I figured you could do well with a notebook for one special hero in particular. So, I had this one custom-made for you to write about your own hero experiences and analyze yourself." He pointed a finger at the cover with his trademark smile. "Becoming a hero isn't a distant dream for the future now, young Midoriya. It's going to become a part of your present quite soon." Izuku stared at the title on the cover, his gaze unbreaking. He kept reading it over and over again to check the validity of it and ensure that it was real. When it finally hit him that he wasn't being pranked or that it wasn't a figment of his imagination, a shaky smile spread across his face and he could feel a lump begin to rise in his throat. Thick, hot tears started to roll down his cheeks and his attempts to hold back a sob were weak at best. He managed to bring a hand to his lips in time to muffle it, but even so, he couldn't stop the flood coming from his eyes. "Oh," All Might said, "oh, do you not like it? I thought you'd like a new notebook since your last one got burned, but if you'd rather I take this one back." Izuku hugged the notebook to his chest. "No, don't take it back." "Oh," All Might exclaimed, retracting his hand. "So, you do like it?" Izuku nodded, a small sob escaping past his lips. "I'll love it. He never gotten such a nice present from someone before." All Might blinked. "Oh, really? They didn't think it would mean that much to you." "Of course it means a lot to me," Izuku blurted out. He swiped at his cheek furiously as he regarded All Might. "And most people think my notes are weird. The only person who ever buys me new notebooks is my mom." He thought back to the burns that marred his 13th volume and his face crumpled a bit. I won't let anything bad happen to it, All Might." "Oh my boy," All Might said softly. He placed his hand on Izuku's shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze, which nearly broke Izuku all over again. "I have no doubt in my mind that you'll take good care of it." Izuku choked back another sob. Thank you." His mentor said nothing for a long moment, his piercing blue eyes gazing down at Izuku's shaking form as he tried to gather himself. He hated that he could get so caught up in his emotions at times, but once the faucet got to pouring, it was hard for him to turn it off. The notebook remained flush to his chest like an old stuffed toy he never thought he'd see again, and Izuku could only wonder what he'd fill its crisp new pages with. "Young Midoriya," All Might began, causing him to blink, "there's something I need to talk to you about." Izuku faced All Might with wide, teary eyes. Had he changed his mind? Had he decided not to have Izuku as a successor after all? Was this gift just a consolation prize for all his efforts? Izuku hugged the notebook tighter and bit his bottom lip at the very thought. "Come," All Might told him, releasing his shoulder, "take a seat. I have a lot to tell you." Unsure of what else to do, Izuku followed after All Might, his feet dragging on the cleared. When his mentor took a seat at the bottom step, Izuku joined him, his hands still clutching his new notebook like a lifeline. Then, the silence was broken by a puff of smoke, and there All Might sat in his true form, his jaw set in contemplation. "I struggled with telling you this," All Might admitted suddenly, his eyes not meeting Izuku's, "but now that we've reached the end of the first phase of your training, I feel it wouldn't be right for me to keep this from you, especially before I give you my quirk." His eyes stared endlessly out into the open horizon that Izuku cleared out, and his hands clutched his knees. "The quirk that I chose for you to inherit is unique in nature, and you should know of its origin." Izuku's breath hitched. "Its origin?" All Might nodded, though he still didn't turn to Izuku. "One for All has been passed down many generations and has been held by 7 other holders than myself." His eyes fell out of focus for a brief second before he shook his head and they fell back into concentration. "But its beginnings came from another quirk, one that is very old and came about when quirks had just begun to manifest. Society had yet to find a way to navigate living with the newly powered among the populace, and many struggled with knowing what it meant to be a normal person." "Used to be something else?" Izuku asked. Were he not so transfixed, he would have tried to see if he had a pen or pencil on him. Instead, he stared at his mentor with rapt attention, his eyes wide. "The name of that quirk," All Might began, his voice growing firm, "was All for One. It allowed its user to take quirks from others, either to pass on to others or to keep for himself." A chill ran down Izuku's spine. "You mean, he could just take someone's quirk? He wasn't just duplicating it or mimicking it, but actually just stealing it?" All Might's hand clenched tighter on his knees. "Yes. During the era of chaos and confusion where the world's populace argued over human rights and laws about quirks, All for One came about. The world already had its fair share of issues, and the introduction of quirks only exacerbated tensions, throwing a wrench into the mechanics of society as we knew it." Society stalled, Izuku observed aloud. "I remember hearing someone say that if quirks didn't show up, people would be having interstellar holidays by now." "It's true," All Might replied. "The progress society had made was overcome by discourse and debate amongst the world's powers, and the populace faced the brunt of it. During that chaotic period, one person managed to rally the restless together. His gaze hardened as he stared out into the setting sun. That man went by All for One, the name of his power. He stole quirks from others, gaining an overwhelming amount of power that granted him influence across the entire country. His followers fell prey to his manipulation while he committed unspeakable acts with little resistance, and soon enough, he had gained control of villains all over Japan. Izuku stared at All Might, his eyes unable to blink. In his years of analysis and research, he had delved into the origin of quirks and how they manifested throughout the generations, partially out of some naive hope that he would find a sliver of a chance that he would manifest a quirk of his own. Still, the early generations of quirks were mostly shrouded in mystery and were brushed over in any history classes covering the subject. Speculation ran amok online, and Izuku himself was engrossed in it as a young teen, but even so, he found most theories to be too unsubstantiated to be taken seriously. Isn't that all just made-up theories? Izuku questioned, his hands shaking a bit. I've read about it online, but if it was true, they'd teach it to us in school, wouldn't they? All Might's expression turned grave. History isn't always told through a truthful perspective, young Midoriya. Much has been omitted to keep the newer generations unaware of the facts of that era. He looked down. There were many campaigns and efforts made by organizations to lobby for that era of history to be all but struck from the record of the public out of utter shame for what took place. But, Izuku tried to say. He swallowed thickly and clutched his notebook tighter. But what does this have to do with One for All? All for One was able to give quirks to others, young Midoriya, All Might answered, and instantly, Izuku went very still. He was able to get people to trust him or outright submit to his will by altering their abilities. Those who were unable to handle the power they were given became mindless puppets for him to use, incapable of even speaking. Then he finally turned and met Izuku's wide-eyed gaze. Meanwhile, some quirks began to evolve as they were passed on or even combined with other power sets. Like Kaken, Izuku thought to himself. In Volume 2 of his notebooks, he had a full spread on the entire Bakugo family, with Auntie Mitsuki being able to secrete glycerin from her skin and how Uncle Masaru would sweat acid in lieu of normal sweat. While Masaru couldn't sweat at will and would need to clap in order to cause explosions, Kaken was able to secrete nitroglycerin and cause explosions at will, like how his mother could secrete glycerin. It made for a terrifying combination and made him especially powerful in combat, as the more he fought, the more he was able to sweat and create bigger explosions. All for One had a sickly younger brother, All Might continued, breaking Izuku out of his thoughts, and he was assumed to be quirkless. But despite that, he had a strong sense of justice and doing what was morally right. He chuckled humorlessly. The two couldn't have been more different. Then his frown returned. Despite his sickness, the brother fought back against All for One and deeply despised the man that he was. He fought back while being quirkless? Izuku blurted out. All Might nodded, and something akin to a smile spread across his lips. Remind you of anyone? Despite the burn in his ears, Izuku pressed on. But what happened to him? He couldn't have possibly been able to stand up to All for One while being quirkless, could he? You're right, All Might replied, but he didn't remain quirkless for long. His eyes fell away from Izuku's gaze. All for One gave his brother a quirk, one that would allow him to stockpile power. Whether it was a gift to aid his sickly brother or something he forced upon him to make him submit. I can only assume it was the second. That, Izuku began, the shake in his hands returning, that sounds like. And you're right, All Might interjected, it turned out that the brother wasn't actually quirkless. After All for One gave him the quirk, the brother realized that he had been born with a quirk that was useless before his brother gave him that power, the ability to pass on quirks to others. He finally brought his gaze up to meet Izuku's once again. The brother to All for One was the original holder of One for All. Izuku couldn't stop himself from gasping aloud. He stared at All Might in total shock and bewilderment, unable to find what to say. His mind was running a mile a minute, faster than his words could possibly begin to catch up to, and he was only left grasping for dear life as the full weight of everything All Might said came down. For years, he wondered what the source of All Might's power and ability came from, but he couldn't possibly ever have imagined it being anything like what he was hearing. To think that something that made All Might so powerful once came from something so evil, it felt wrong. What happened to All for One? Izuku found himself asking. He's not still alive, is he? He can't be, it's been generations. There are quirks to halt aging, young Midoriya, All Might reminded him, and instantly, Izuku felt a weight settle at the pit of his stomach, and due to the sheer number of quirks he stole, he was practically immortal. The tremors in Izuku's hands only grew. But, Ichi's not still around, is he? W'd know if he was. All Might met Izuku's fearful gaze with a steely stare. The original holder of One for All knew that he wouldn't be able to stand up to his brother in his current state. So he entrusted it with the future generations so that it would grow in power, and eventually, one of the future holders would hold the strength necessary to stand up to All for One. He brought his fist to his chest and closed his eyes. I was the one to finish it, once and for all. You fought All for One? Izuku exclaimed. I did, All Might answered. Then, when he opened his eyes, they fell out of focus, like he wasn't looking at Izuku anymore. It was almost as if he were in a completely different time and place. It took almost everything in me to do it, but I finally finished it. The twisted scar that marred All Might's side flashed to the forefront of Izuku's mind. Was he the one who? All Might's knuckles turned white. Yes, he was. Suddenly, it hit Izuku just what All Might meant by finished it. The fight had taken place 5 years prior, long before he met Izuku or could have possibly been looking for a successor to take on after him when he eventually lost his power for good. With a hole blown into his side and no successor to take on the burden, he could have only been left with one option. You had to kill him, didn't you? Izuku whispered. All Might's focus snapped back onto Izuku. His mentor said nothing for a long moment, his eyes widening with shock. Izuku could only guess what was running through his mind at the moment, and for a flicker of a moment, he thought he saw fear flash in All Might's eyes. Finally, All Might's expression settled into something not quite calm, but not entirely pensive either. I'm not proud of it, All Might said finally. I didn't go into the fight with the intention of killing him, but I had no other choice. I hadn't been able to find a successor by that point, and I knew that if I didn't finish him then, there'd be no one else to take on my burden. He closed his eyes. Perhaps someone without the power of One for All would have been able to stand up to him if I hadn't been able to finish him, but I couldn't risk dying if it wasn't a total guarantee. Izuku's brows furrowed. As reprehensible he found the act of killing to be, he ultimately understood what All Might meant. It was a situation where no matter what he did would have had terrible consequences, but would the death of a villain who had wrought generations' worth of chaos onto society really weigh heavier on the heart than countless innocents who would continue to suffer under his wrath? Now you know the truth, young Midoriya, All Might said, breaking him out of his flurrying thoughts. I know that you'll never have to worry about facing All for One, but it didn't feel right keeping this from you. His expression turned into something softer, though Izuku thought he caught a hint of sadness within it. I was about your age when my mentor passed One for All on to me, and while I was faced with the possibility of having to go up against All for One, I still wanted to grant you the same honesty she did me. Izuku tried to say, swallowing a bit. It's a lot to take in, that's for sure. You've done some amazing things while training, young Midoriya, All Might told him, but as honored as I would be to have you as a successor, he closed his eyes. You need to know the full weight of this quirk before you decide to inherit it. It is an incredible power that must not be taken lightly, and it will only grow stronger once you have it. I don't want to force such a burden. I'll do my best, Izuku proclaimed. All Might's eyes snapped open and he stared at Izuku with wide eyes. What? I'll do whatever it takes to become a hero, Izuku vowed, holding his notebook close to him. All my life, all I've ever wanted to do is help people and be a shining beacon of hope like you. A smile spread across his face. And it's because of you that I'm able to focus on fighting other evils beyond All for One. So, I want to be able to use this power for more than what it was made for. You, All Might began, his voice trailing off for a moment. You still want to be my successor? Izuku nodded. Of course I do. I want to be able to help as many people as I can, and I can only do that with your quirk to help me. He faltered for a moment. I know what it's like to be helpless. To not be able to save the people you care about. Kaken's wide, terrified eyes flashed across his mind. And I don't want anyone to ever feel the way I did during those times. All Might's bewilderment didn't fade. You really mean it? You still want me to train you? Of course. Izuku replied. Before you, everyone kept telling me I never had a chance of becoming a hero. He looked down at the emerald green cover of the notebook in his grasp and his smile only grew. But then you gave me one, and now I want to see it through to the end. He faced All Might with a bright smile. With you by my side, I'll be able to do anything. All Might's hand went to his heart, his mouth falling agape. Words seemed to escape him, as nothing fell past his open lips for a long moment, and Izuku wondered if he had said something wrong. Had All Might told him the truth in an attempt to get him to back out of it? Was Izuku not wanting to back out of it not what he expected, or worse, wanted? Was he asking Izuku if he wanted out not out of concern, but out of a desire to end their training? Then, a soft smile spread across All Might's face and all of Izuku's worries went away. Thank you, my boy. I'm happy to hear that you still want to train with me. You are? Izuku replied. He tried to ignore the burn in his eyes. You don't regret picking me? Of course not, All Might answered instantly, and his lack of hesitation sent a wave of great emotion through Izuku. I don't regret that one bit, young Midoriya. He laid a hand on Izuku's shoulder. I know you said that you're lucky to have me a mentor, but if I'm honest, my boy, I'm the lucky one. I'd be lying if I said I didn't sometimes wonder how different my life would be if you hadn't grabbed a hold of my leg and didn't let go. Izuku snorted and clapped his hand over his mouth to smother a laugh. Not exactly my best moment, All Might. All Might chuckled. Be that as it may, it certainly made an impression, and I'm glad for it. Then, his mentor stood up straight and his bulky muscles returned with a baritone laugh that made Izuku fall back in surprise. Despite being in a casual outfit, All Might had never looked more heroic under the light of the setting sun. His fists rested on his hips in his signature pose. Now, All Might proclaimed, it's time for your award ceremony. Izuku straightened up and scrambled to stand up. Why, sir? All Might laughed as Izuku managed to stand up before him. My boy, someone once told me that there's a difference between being lucky and being deserving. One is an accident, but the other is a reward. He clapped his hand onto Izuku's shoulder, nearly making him fall over. Never get the two confused. Take that to heart, young man. The tears began to blur Izuku's vision, and his smile started to waver as a sob threatened to bubble up in his throat. He could only wonder if All Might once stood before his own mentor with tears in his eyes and heard those same words be spoken to him, his future becoming as bright as the smile that inspired Izuku's own. This gift, All Might continued, his form growing blurry, you earned it with your own valiant efforts and determination. Through his tears, Izuku could see All Might's hand reach towards him and Izuku reached back towards him, his tired, quirkless hands ready to take All Might's power into his grasp. All the work he had been doing for the past several months had culminated into this moment, granting him the ability to continue running down his path to become the world's greatest hero. He stopped trying to blink back the tears and let them flow freely so that he could face All Might clearly. Izuku wished his mother was here to be able to see this incredible moment. Now, All Might proclaimed, and it was then that Izuku saw a long blonde strand of hair in his grasp. Eat this. Toshinori had barely been able to catch a wink when he finally managed to get home and into bed, his night spent in quiet contemplation of the morning to come and the challenges it would no doubt bring. His eyes bore endlessly into his ceiling for what felt like an eternity before they startled open at the sound of his custom alarm that simply proclaimed, I am awake, over and over again until he finally stirred enough to snooze it. He dragged himself out of bed with a sigh and got dressed, not even bothering to spare a look in the mirror on his way out. Toshinori had never liked looking at his reflection. The drive down to Takoba was a quiet, albeit tense trip for him as he mentally prepared himself for his lesson with young Midoriya. He tried to keep his focus on the road, but with his anxiety creeping deep into the place where his stomach used to reside, he found it hard to keep his mind from wandering. Despite all the discussions he and Nezu had about his protege, Toshinori would be a liar if he said he felt completely prepared for everything that was to come with their next phase of training. He could only hope that he could measure up to what young Midoriya needed. Master, I pray that the wisdom you imparted onto me will allow me to aid him the same way it did me, Toshinori mused. May your light shine down on him this morning. Once he pulled into the parking lot and put it in park, he was greeted by the familiar silhouette of the heaps of trash that littered the beach. Toshinori could only wonder how the beach was allowed to get to such a state and how long it would have taken for someone else to take action were it not for young Midoriya's efforts. A small smile tugged at his lips when he stepped outside and saw his protege standing at the top of the steps, practically dancing on his feet while he stared out into the small section of the horizon he restored. The light of the rising sun cast a gentle glow across the young boy's head as he turned to look at Toshinori, his smile bright and his eyes practically shining with excitement. You got here early, Toshinori observed, walking closer to meet up with him. He arched his brow when he noted the lines beneath Midoriya's eyes. Did you even sleep last night? Midoriya chuckled and rubbed the back of his head. Yeah, but only a bit. I was just excited, you know. Toshinori's smile grew. Well, I'm glad that you're pumped to start your next phase of training. How could I not be? Midoriya exclaimed. He closed his eyes and started rocking back and forth on the balls of his feet. I've been waiting for this day. He stopped and opened his eyes with a beaming smile. I promise I won't let you down, All Might. I'm certain you won't, Toshinori told him. He nodded towards the stairs. Let's go ahead and head down so we can get started, shall we? Midoriya practically darted down the stairs, forgoing the last few steps in an enthusiastic leap that sent sand everywhere upon impact. Toshinori snorted mirthfully and stepped down to join him. A cloud escaped his lips, causing him to draw his coat further in on himself. Meanwhile, Midoriya danced on his feet a bit in anticipation and seemed mostly unbothered by the cold air despite being only in a tracksuit. So what are we starting on first? Midoriya asked. Are we going to be covering your state smashes? Or are we going to go over some lesser-known attacks? He gasped with sparkling eyes. Are we going to make a whole new attack just for me? Toshinori chuckled. Settle down, my boy. We'll cover all of those things in due time. But, for now, we need to set a solid foundation for you to even use your quirk. He held up his index finger. You may have had months of training under your belt to prepare your body, but today is day one, my boy. We can't have you firing if you don't know how to load the cylinders first. Midoriya nodded, still bouncing from foot to foot. Makes sense. Indeed, Toshinori replied. Now, let's try to see if you can activate it. Right? Midoriya acknowledged. Then he paused in his footwork. How exactly do I do that? It's something you feel deep within you that you call upon, Toshinori answered. Once you grab a hold of it, he placed a hand over his heart. You just know. Midoriya tilted his head curiously. Is that how it felt the first time you used it? Was it hard to do? Toshinori shook his head. Not really. It came naturally to me. One for all felt less like a superpower and more like an extension of myself. His fingers clutched the fabric of his jacket. It felt as natural as my own heartbeat, as if it was always a part of me. It felt as simple as breathing. Wow, Midoriya said, so it's this intuitive thing you don't even have to think about? He brought a hand to his chin in thought. I said, it makes sense, considering you've had it for so long. Thinking about it probably makes it harder to use it, too. He perked up. And with breathing, if you focus on it too much, then it can actually make it harder to breathe. Is it the same way with One for All? It is, Toshinori answered. It's just... well, I can't put it into words. It feels kind of like... He swept his hand through the air sharply. Whoosh. Whoosh. Midoriya repeated. Toshinori blinked and stared at his hand before retracting it with a sigh. That probably doesn't make much sense, does it? Midoriya shook his head and waved his hands frantically. And now it does. I mean, it's just like, he pumped his fist into the air. Kapow! His eyes met with Toshinori's. That's how you do your smashes, right? In a sense, Toshinori replied, trying not to let his anxiety show. He held back the urge to sigh. Why was this so hard? When he was with his own master, everything just made sense. Why couldn't he do the same for his protege? It's this thing inside of you that's a part of you, but you still have to control it. He placed his hand back over his chest. Once you bring it out, you know the feeling deep down to your very core. Like this heat that spreads throughout your body anytime you use it. His eyes fell to a close and he clutched his jacket. But if you don't keep it contained, you run the risk of letting it run wild. One for All's beginnings may have been humble, but that had just been the spark to ignite the flame that had been passed down for generations. The 7 holders that came before Toshinori all held the torch and added onto its flame, his own mentor imparting words of wisdom to not only help it grow but keep it controlled. Sometimes, it felt like the only thing keeping Toshinori alive was that flame inside of him and that all he could do was sit beside it for warmth in the midst of the storm growing around him. He knew more than anyone how dangerous that flame could be, however, should he not be careful. Using one for all was simply not enough. It had to be controlled and measured. Just like an egg in the microwave, Midoriya proclaimed. Toshinori nearly choked. What? An egg in the microwave? Midoriya repeated. If you put it in for too long, then it can explode. He held his index finger up. But if you balance it just right, then the heat spreads evenly throughout and you make something great. Toshinori stared in silence. He was certain that if he had said something like that in front of Gran Torino back when he was a student, the old man would have laughed in his face for such an absurd comparison, if not be outright offended by comparing such power to something as mundane as food. Sounds like your eggs are a little scrambled, kiddo. His voice echoed in his head, almost as if he were speaking to Toshinori in person. Gran would have cuffed his ear for good measure, too, knowing him. It's not what I would have thought of, Toshinori thought to himself. Then, his mind traced back to what Nezu said to him the other day. The best teachers know when and how to adapt, All Might. Sticking to one method isn't always going to cut it and can sometimes slow progress. With Midoriya still smiling, Toshinori managed to mirror it back to him. If that's what makes the most sense to you, then sure. He brought a hand to his chin in thought. Just, think of activating it like pressing the microwave start button. Midoriya nodded. Got it. And if I'm having trouble balancing it, I can just adjust the wattage or the cook time. Now you're getting it, Toshinori said. That's the key to controlling one for all, balance. You have to make sure to keep a focus on how you use it so you don't lose control of it. His smile widened. We don't want that egg exploding, now do we? Nope. Midoriya replied. He made a fist and held it up. Should I try to imagine my fist as the egg to start? Toshinori nodded. That's a good place to begin. We can work our way up as you learn to control certain limbs. Awesome. Midoriya proclaimed. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. Just pretend you're the microwave, Izuku. Toshinori bit his bottom lip to hold back the urge to smile. Come on, Toshi, keep it together. Can't make him lose focus. You're the microwave, Midoriya repeated, inhaling deeply through his nose. Toshinori tried his best not to snort. Had he been like that when he was a teenager? You're the microwave and you have the egg in your hand? He clenched his fist tighter. Now just make sure it doesn't explode. There was a definitive crackle of energy in the air and Toshinori went still. He stared with wide eyes as Midoriya's fist seemed to come aglow with power, causing him to bring his hand to his mouth with surprise. By God, had that done it? Had he really summoned one for all for the first time? Don't let it explode, Midoriya whispered. Don't let it explode. Then, the glow started to spread from his fist all the way up his arm. Panicked, Toshinori's hands clasped together in front of his chest. Was he struggling to control it? In an instant, the energy went away and Midoriya gasped aloud. He grabbed his forearm with a heaving breath, his eyes wide as he stared down at it. Toshinori's brows furrowed when Midoriya winced. My boy, are you all right? He began, his voice soft. Then, Midoriya's eyes shot up to meet with Toshinori's and they practically sparkled. I did it. I summoned it. And it didn't explode. He breathed out a laugh when he looked down at his hand and flexed it, only to wince again. But why did it hurt? How much energy did you use? Toshinori questioned. his brows furrowed with worry. Did you try firing off at full power? No, Midoriya answered quickly. His resolve faltered when his mentor didn't appear convinced. But maybe I bit off a bit more than I could chew. Toshinori offered him a soft smile. Well, now you know that was too much for you for now. I'm just happy you didn't try to fire off at all cylinders. Midoriya blinked. So that wasn't even full power. He flexed out his fingers. But I was trying so hard to contain it. How close was I to achieving full power? Toshinori shrugged. It's hard to say. One for all is stronger now that it's been passed down to you, my boy. You're going to struggle to reach full power at the beginning. He crossed his arms over his chest. Right now, it's better to focus on more manageable goals. You can't just jump to 100%. So, what's a good percentage for me to start at? Midoriya asked. Well, when I first started, I worked at about, Toshinori drawled, looking up as he searched the recesses of his mind. He snapped his fingers when it clicked. I'd say about 5%. 5%? Midoriya repeated. Your body still isn't used to it, remember? Toshinori reminded him. You're not going to be able to go at full power just yet? Midoriya's brows furrowed. Well, how long until I am able to use it at full power? It's a process, my boy, Toshinori replied. You're not going to have it down pat the first day, you know? Midoriya frowned. I guess you're right. Toshinori arched his brow. What is it? Is something bothering you? It's nothing, Midoriya answered, far too fast for Toshinori's liking. When he didn't let up his stare, however, Midoriya let out a sigh. Well, it's just... I always wanted a quirk, you know? And now that I have one, I guess I thought it would be different, somehow? He held his hands up. And not that I'm ungrateful, it's just, I've seen so many different quirks from my classmates and they can do amazing things with them. He looked down at his hand and flexed his fingers again with a frown. But it feels like I'm not measuring up to them. A tug of pain hit Toshinori's chest upon hearing that. While it had been about 40 years since he had been quirkless, he could still viscerally recall how it felt to be a young lad without a power to his name. Quirklessness may not have been a rarity while he was growing up, but it was still a trait that made him a prime target for any who wished to do him harm, whether they be peers or criminals. Now, with quirklessness growing increasingly uncommon with each passing generation and quirks becoming more powerful than ever, he could only wonder how it felt to be a young lad sitting on the sidelines while everyone ran a race he would never get to experience. That's why you like to write them down, isn't it, young Midoriya? Toshinori mused. You wanted to learn everything you can about what you thought you'd never have? Toshinori placed a hand on his shoulder, causing the young boy to jump. Hey, I know that this might not have been what you were expecting, but you have to remember that your peers have had years to hone in their power. He gave his shoulder a squeeze. Meanwhile, you've only had a couple of months to prepare your body for it and you're only on day one of actually using it. Midoriya blinked when Toshinori smiled and tapped him on the nose. Don't pay them any mind. You're still playing catch-up? A weak smile spread across Midoriya's lips. I guess so. Besides, that was only your first try, Toshinori stressed, and I know you're not ready to give up after that. He nodded towards the rising sun. We've still got a whole day ahead of us, my boy. Let's not put it to waste. Midoriya's smile brightened back up. Alright, yeah. He pumped his fist into the air. My egg isn't cooked yet. Toshinori snorted. It sure isn't, my boy. It sure isn't. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Izuku had barely been able to catch a wink when he finally managed to get home and into bed, his limbs still aching from training and his mind racing. His eyes bore endlessly into the ceiling while he waited for sleep to take him, but despite his exhaustion, he just couldn't seem to get his eyes to close. Even with a full belly and a shower to reward him for his efforts, Izuku was unable to shake the thoughts that ran rampant through his mind. All those months, he thought, all those months on the beach to train for one for all. Izuku lifted his hand up and stared at his palm. And I can barely do a thing with it? Logistically, Izuku knew that he couldn't expect to jump to All Might's level on his first day. Still, he couldn't quite shake the feeling of disappointment in knowing that he wasn't capable of doing much more than call forth his power, let alone control it. Despite the oddity of having to swallow All Might's hair, he had been raring to go on training his newfound ability and had launched off into asking a litany of questions about the logistics of it, how they would train for it, and what came next. His momentum came to a screeching halt when All Might had to inform him that it would take a couple of hours minimum for his body to process his DNA and, in turn, integrate with his own system. As disappointed as he was, All Might lessened the blow by telling him they would be getting a fresh start in the morning, when it was guaranteed to have finally processed through his system. Izuku returned to his house in time for dinner, only for his mother to nearly drop the dish entirely when he broke the news of his graduation to her. After she managed to set the dish down on the table, she tackled him in a hug and lifted him up by a mere inch out of sheer excitement and pride, her cheeks wet with tears. "My baby's going to be a hero," she exclaimed, the memory of which still made Izuku's heart swell. Dinner may have been small, but it was a celebration nonetheless. She asked him for all the details of his graduation, and Izuku was met with wonder and awe as he recounted the speech All Might gave to him while he stood before him with tears in his eyes. Then, when he showed her the notebook All Might got him, tears flooded her eyes and she broke down all over again. Izuku couldn't really blame her, considering he hadn't fared much better when he got it just a couple hours prior. Bedtime came faster than he expected, and although his heart felt light, he found himself unable to sleep well into the night. It was so strange to think of how different his life was in just a few months' time, and how what could have been the worst day of his life quickly turned into the beginning of something great. Less than a year ago, he had been quirkless and left to the mercy of whatever the world threw at him. The night before, he was mere hours away from being able to exercise a power of his own to combat the chaotic forces that threatened the safety of their world. Now, he felt like he didn't deserve the fanfare at all. "Don't pay them any mind," All Might's voice echoed in his head. "You're still playing catch-up?" Izuku snorted. That was easy for him to say, wasn't it? All Might didn't have to grow up as the only quirkless kid at his elementary school and watch as everyone around him got their quirks, while Izuku had to stand by and wonder why his hadn't come in yet. All Might didn't have to overhear his mother talk on the phone with Auntie Mitsuki and tearfully tell her that the doctor said he wouldn't ever develop a quirk. All Might didn't have to watch as everyone in his life started to shift their tone around him, as if he were a fragile little thing that could break at any given moment if someone so much as breathed on him too hard. All Might didn't have to play the citizen or helpless bystander any time his classmates played heroes, and that was if he was invited to play at all. All Might didn't have to watch as his friends started to drift away from him while he was helpless to do anything but ask, why, over and over again, only to be met with the simple answer of, you know why. Worthless Deku. Izuku closed his eyes with a frown. Although Kaken had backed off of him in light of the incident with the sludge villain, that didn't mean that he had exactly been warm towards Izuku either. Judging by the intensity of his gaze any time they crossed paths in the hallway at school, it was still very clear that Kaken had yet to let go of his grudge against Izuku for wanting to try out for Yue. How is he going to respond when he sees me with my new power? Izuku wondered. His hands clutched his covers tightly. What if I'm not able to control it and I fail? He could hear the taunts already, loud and clear. Kaken always did have a way of reminding him of the long-growing distance between the two of them. Izuku could almost consider it a talent how he managed to find new ways to insult him and discredit everything he did, no matter how big or small it was. Fought your way just to get to the bottom. He could hear Kaken say, well, at least you proved us all right, at Deku? Izuku hated that it was instinctive for him to duck his head down at just the thought of Kaken's voice. He knew deep down that he didn't mean the things he said. Who on earth would actually say something like that to someone and mean it? But it still hurt to hear, nonetheless. Still, he knew that it wasn't his fault. He was just stressed because he was trying to get into Yue, and Izuku knew how anti-Mitsuki was, so he couldn't blame Kaken for being so frustrated all the time. Kaken had bigger things to worry about than Izuku's feelings, so he wasted no time in mincing words to get his point across. Usually it didn't bother him. He may not have always liked what Kaken had to say, but he got pretty used to hearing it with time. Besides, Kaken was naturally talented and Izuku could stand to learn a lot from him. That was why he had multiple sections on him throughout his different volumes detailing his growth and evolution. It wasn't his fault that Izuku was so sensitive sometimes. I just need to do better, Izuku told himself, I need to work harder to gain control. When Izuku sat up and swung his feet over the edge of the bed to stand up and stride over to his closet, he wasn't sure what his plan was. It wasn't until he slipped on his tracksuit and his red sneakers before making his way out of the house without his mother hearing that he realized where his feet were carrying him. The light of the moon cast a soft glow across Takoba when he arrived, illuminating the silhouette of the heaps of trash that were still left behind. Despite the ache in his bones and the burn in his tired eyes, Izuku still made a break for the beach once it came into his sights. One foot after the other and you'll get there in due time. I know you're not ready to give up after that. I have to earn this power, Izuku thought. I need to be more than just a vessel for it to use. He cracked his knuckles and readied his stance. I need to be the one using it. He stared at the heap before him and dug his heels into the sand to steady himself. As much as he wanted to summon one for all to come to his aid, he kept the flame inside of him down to a simmer. My egg isn't cooked yet, Izuku told himself. Time for me to turn up the wattage. Inko would be lying if she said she wasn't a little nervous when the day of the entrance exam finally approached. As happy as she was to finally see how Izuku would fare after months of hard work and determination, it was in her nature to worry about him. She wanted to believe that the past 2 months of training with All Might had been enough to prepare him, but with the way he struggled to get out of bed on some mornings, Inko's anxieties often robbed her of a good night's rest. It's so strange to think he has a quirk now, Inko thought as she went to bed on the eve of the exam. So much has changed these past few months. Just 10 years ago, Inko had held Izuku in her arms and shed tears alongside him as she apologized for the hand he had been dealt and prayed that things could be different for him somehow. That dreaded night felt like such a distant memory when he returned the night of his graduation and she held him in her arms with teary eyes, thanking the gods above that her prayers were finally answered after all those years of turmoil. The shy, timid boy she watched grow up had started to blossom into a more confident and determined young man whose smile had turned as bright as when he was just a toddler running around the living room in a little All Might onesie. I'm so proud of you, Izuku, she thought. I feel like I don't say that enough. Those were her final thoughts before she drifted off into a deep sleep that she would later stir from once her alarm finally went off. With a bounce in her step, Inko climbed out of bed and rushed into the kitchen in her pajamas to make breakfast for Izuku while he slept off his training session from yesterday. His alarm wasn't set to go off for another hour or so, giving her ample time to make him his favorite breakfast dish before the exam. He had been working so hard and she knew that he had been stressed with how training for his new quirk was coming along, so she wanted to alleviate as much stress as possible in whatever way she could, even if it was something as small as making him a nice meal. She wanted him to have a full stomach and a bright smile on his face when he finally went down to show you what he was made of. Inko carried on as quickly and as quietly as she could so that he wouldn't have to rush to eat, ignoring the growl of her own stomach to focus on meal prep. He needs as much rest as he can get, Inko thought. He looks like hasn't been sleeping so well these past couple weeks. Ever since Izuku returned home from his first lesson after his graduation ceremony, there had been an undeniable shift in the way her son carried himself. As soon as he stepped inside, she babbled a litany of questions about his lesson and what he learned, only to be taken aback by how reserved his response was. At first, she thought it was because he was tired and figured that he would be in better spirits in the morning when he got some rest. However, when Izuku stepped out of his room the following morning with heavy feet, it became pretty clear that there was more to it than what he let on. We still have a lot of work to do, he told her while scooping up his breakfast. I just need to keep practicing until I get it right. She supposed it couldn't be helped. Working with a quirk when he didn't have one for the first 14 years of his life was sure to lead to some trial and error, so perhaps she should be thankful that the worst thing to come out of it thus far was lack of sleep. Besides, it wasn't like Izuku set the gold standard for healthy sleeping habits prior to having a quirk, especially considering he used to stay up late and read All Might comics and magazines under the light of his flashlight as if she couldn't see the light peeking out from the bottom of his door. Inko snorted and shook her head with a smile. That boy was going to be the absolute death of her. Once she finally finished up breakfast and set it down on the table, Inko tossed aside her dirty apron with a relieved sigh. She turned towards the wall clock to check the time and went still, noting it was a couple minutes past when Izuku's alarm was supposed to go off. Had he forgotten to turn it on the night before? Frowning, she tiptoed down the hall until she reached his door and leaned in to listen for the sound of his all-might alarm. When she didn't hear it, she gave his door a light knock. "Izuku," she sang out softly. "Did your alarm go off?" No answer. "Izuku," Inko said, her brows furrowing a bit. "Are you awake, dear?" Again, no answer. Inko sighed and grabbed the doorknob. "All right, honey, I know you're probably tired, but you have to get up." Then, as she opened the door to her son's room, she froze. The bed where he should have been sound asleep in was left unoccupied, the blankets and sheets still made up nicely. Inko blinked as if her eyes were playing tricks on her, only for them to widen with terror when it only confirmed her worst fears. "Izuku," she breathed, panic creeping into her voice. "Izuku, where are you, sweetie?" She rushed into his room and opened up the closet doors, only to be met with his clothes and shoes, but not him. With a shuddering breath, she ran out of his room and down the hall to the bathroom, nearly swinging the door off its hinges when she stepped inside. "Izuku!" Inko exclaimed. "This isn't funny, where are you?" Once again she wasn't given an answer. "Oh God," Inko whispered, "oh God, where is he?" Her feet carried her before she knew it. She grabbed her coat off from the coat rack and slung on her scarf over her pajamas, deciding to forego actual shoes in favor of her bunny slippers. They may not have been the most practical choice, but Inko didn't have the time to think about it. She grabbed her phone from the counter and fumbled for a moment when searching through her contacts before she tapped on Mitsuki's profile. "Come on, Suki, pick up," Inko stressed. "I need you to pick up." Then, to her dismay, it went straight to voicemail. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." Frustrated, she went back to her contact list and tapped onto Izuku's profile. As the first round of rings started to make their way through her speaker, she wrapped her jacket tighter around herself and made a beeline straight for the front door. The scent of the breakfast she had made brought an unexpected sting to her eyes, and she tried desperately to blink back the tears she knew were coming as she made her way outside. "Come on, baby," Inko thought as she locked the door to the apartment. "Where have you gone off to?" Toshinori wasn't sure what he was expecting to see when he came to Takoba on that cold February day to meet up with young Midoriya. After the past couple of months of training, he was hoping that he would come face to face with his young apprentice on the day of the exam to offer him words of wisdom and encouragement like his own mentor had all those decades ago. The night before, he kept cycling through his speech over and over again until he felt he got it down right, not wanting to set a poor tone for young Midoriya's day. He felt like the boy could use the boost after all the hard work he had been doing. The past 2 months of training with One for All felt both long and yet like not enough time at all. So far, Toshinori and Midoriya had worked on honing in on his control and ability to summon forth his new power so that it became less of a chore. Now, young Midoriya could summon One for All to both of his arms and was capable of using his newfound strength to his advantage. Toshinori knew that they were just barely scratching the surface of his potential, considering he was just scraping by with 5% or less. "You're about to reach the light at the end of the tunnel," Toshinori mused as he laid in bed the eve of the exam. "From here on out, your light will only continue to grow." Just 40 years ago, Toshinori himself had stood in front of his mentor on the day of his entrance exam at UA with burning eyes and looked into her sterling gray orbs as she rested both of her hands on his shoulders and gave him that bright smile that always seemed to ease his anxieties on even his hardest days. That day still felt so fresh in his memory as he stepped out of his car and made his way down to the beachline to meet with his own protege, hopeful that he could give the young boy the same feeling of assurance in his chest that his own mentor did. The shy, timid boy he came to know had started to blossom into a more confident and determined young man whose smile shone bright throughout his long journey. "You've come so far, my boy," Toshinori thought. "Now's the time for you to go the distance." Then again, his young successor always seemed to have a way of surprising him, and nowhere was that more apparent than when he arrived to see the young lad standing atop a trash heap while screaming at the top of his lungs. His shirt was gone from sight as he stood in the light of the rising sun, his back arched forward while he screamed to the high heavens. Startled beyond words, Toshinori ran towards the railing just as Midoriya's cry finally died off with a shuddering gasp and stared off in wonder at his protege's handiwork. Holy crap, Toshinori blurted out, his eyes sweeping across the coast. You cleaned up the entire beach? The coastline that had become a dump seemed like such a far-off nightmare in comparison to the image of perfection that laid before him. With wide eyes, Toshinori could only gape as he searched for any sign of the litter that had robbed so many locals of the horizon, only to find that there was none. His lips pulled up into a stunned smile, and he huffed out a laugh through his nose. There isn't a single speck of trash on the beach, he breathed, still in disbelief, and on the day of the entrance exam, no less, Toshinori's hand went to his heart without thought as he trembled in the cold morning air. Oh, stinking! His excitement practically erupted from his being when he took on his muscular form. Super crap! As the young lad collapsed from the top of the heap, Toshinori found himself in the sand just in time to catch the boy out of the air with a beaming smile. By God, was this kid insane? Excellent work! Toshinori proclaimed, barely able to contain himself. With tired eyes, young Midoriya managed to smile back at him. I finished everything. Oh my, I did it. Toshinori let out a loud, booming laugh. You sure did, fanboy. You really went all out, didn't you? Part of him knew that he should have been stern with the boy for working himself so hard the night before the exam, but at the same time, he couldn't help but feel prideful. The young lad went out of his way to show his dedication and exceeded his expectations multiple times over by clearing out the entire beach. Heavens above, how did he do this? Then he went still. How did he do this? Were you training your quirk on your own out here? Toshinori questioned. He set Midoriya down on the sand and made sure he was steady before letting go. Did you manage to do this with just 5%? Midoriya shook his head. I didn't use one for all at all. Toshinori blinked. You didn't? No, Midoriya affirmed, and it was then that Toshinori saw the way his body trembled. What happened to his coat and shoes? How long had he not been wearing those? I wanted to prove I could handle it. Then, the young boy looked at him with teary eyes. Still shaking, Midoriya choked back a small hiccup and met Toshinori's gaze with determination. I wanted to prove I deserve this, he continued, his voice wavering. Why you put so much time and work into helping me? Midoriya let out a choked sob and swiped at his cheeks furiously. So I did this all by myself to prove I can do it. He put on a warbling smile. I wanted to show that I am not helpless. When Midoriya let out another shuddering sob, Toshinori's heart tugged in his chest. Had he really been worried about that all this time? Did he really think that Toshinori would have any doubts after everything he had shown him already? Oh my boy, Toshinori thought, how can I prove to you that you're already more than enough? The boy jumped when Toshinori's jacket landed on his shoulders. He blinked with surprise and stared up at Toshinori, who crouched down to meet his level with a beaming smile. Look at this, Toshinori told him, holding up his phone for Midoriya to see. This is a photo of you back when we first started all those months ago, my boy. He rested a hand on his shoulder and chuckled. And now look at you. You've come so far. Midoriya's smile returned. You really think so? I do. Toshinori affirmed. He stood upright and planted his fists on his hips. You may still have a long road ahead of you before you're ready to take on my full power and claim it as your own. Then, he held his arms up and gestured to the heap that stood behind him. But you've proven that you'll be able to handle any hurdle that you come across when it comes your way. And that, young Midoriya, is what makes you a worthy successor and hero. A sniffle escaped Midoriya and he drew Toshinori's coat tighter around himself. I don't know what to say. Toshinori let out a brassy laugh. Well, my boy, I'm sure that you can. Izuku! Exclaimed a shrill voice. Startled, Toshinori turned in time to spot a woman he hadn't seen before come barreling down the stairs and onto the beach. Her green hair was pulled back into a messy bun and her pink coat was haphazardly buttoned over a pair of lavender pajamas that were adorned with little bunny rabbits that matched her bunny slippers. After she stumbled upon hitting the sand, she looked left and right frantically before her emerald eyes locked onto Midoriya, who froze beneath her gaze. Tears practically flooded from the woman's eyes and she charged towards them with a choked sob. Izuku, she repeated, her voice breaking. She all but tackled Midoriya into a tight embrace and buried her face in Toshinori's coat. Honey, I was worried sick about you. You scared Mommy so bad when she couldn't find you. Mommy? Toshinori thought. Midoriya tried to say, his eyes darting between Toshinori and the crying woman. With a blink, Toshinori very quickly noted how Midoriya's cheeks went scarlet red and the way his messy hair matched the woman's. His mother pulled back and slapped her hands onto the young boy's cheeks so she could look at him. Sweetie, why did you leave the house so early in the morning without telling me? You scared me half to death when I couldn't find you. Mom, Midoriya sputtered out through squished lips. And you didn't pick up your phone either, she continued. I thought that something bad happened to you. For all I knew, you could have gotten into an accident or been kidnapped by some villains. She squeezed his cheeks with a sniffle. I don't know what I'd do if someone tried to hurt my baby boy. Mom, Midoriya exclaimed, pulling her hands away from his face. Look, I'm sorry I left without telling you. All right? I didn't mean to scare you. He let out a small sigh and released her hands to rest his palms on her shoulders. I just came out here because I was working on a surprise before the exam. His mother blinked. Surprise? What kind of surper? Then she went still. Her eyes widened and her head snapped left and right, as if she just noticed her surroundings. She spun around in a circle to look behind her and back to Midoriya with her mouth still agape. Before Toshinori could think of what to say or do, she screamed so loud that it almost made him jump out of his muscle form. You cleared out the beach, she exclaimed. Her lips pulled up into a bright smile, and she clapped her hands excitedly. Oh my God, you cleared out the whole beach by yourself? Then her smile dropped and her eyes widened. Oh my God, Izuku, you cleared out the whole beach by yourself? Are you insane? Midoriya wilted beneath her gaze. I was jazzed. His mother gasped aloud. Baby, where is your shirt? She did a quick once-over and gasped again when she landed on his feet. Are you barefoot? Izuku, we're on a beach, that's so dangerous. I got hot while I was working, Midoriya protested. Besides, the sand got in my socks and it was rubbing my feet raw. There could be glass out here, his mother replied. You could have cut your feet. Should, Toshinori thought, his head turning back and forth as each of them took turns speaking. Should I stay here or? Mom, I was just trying to, Midoriya tried to say. Izuku, Midoriya, you promised me you wouldn't be keeping any more secrets, she interjected. Secrets? What secrets was she talking about? And today, you decided to sneak out on the day of the entrance exam without telling me just to clean up the beach? Midoriya grinned a bit sheepishly. Would you be mad if I told you that I've been working on it for the past couple of months? She gasped. Izuku. It was supposed to be a surprise. Midoriya told her. I wasn't trying to sneak around, I just wanted to. He let out a defeated sigh. I just wanted to show you what I could do. Almost instantly, her gaze softened. Izuku, sweetie, I think it's nice that you wanted to finish doing your workout here on the beach. She placed her hand on his shoulder and smiled. I know how hard you've been working to clean this place these past few months. Then she frowned at him sternly. But you scared me this morning. I mean, I had no idea where you were. I didn't know if you were with All Might or… Toshinori was certain he tasted iron when he coughed. What? Midoriya's mother blinked and she turned quizzically to regard Toshinori. Her confusion lasted for only a moment before a gasp startled out of her throat and she clapped both of her hands over her gaping mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Midoriya, meanwhile, looked as though he wanted the world to swallow him whole and tucked himself further into Toshinori's jacket. Unsure of what to do, Toshinori slowly lifted his hand up in a little wave. Hello there, he greeted, trying to hide his discomfort. I don't believe we've met before. I am All Might, Midoriya cut in, his voice incredibly small. I don't think now's a good time for that. She began softly, her eyes still wide. Slowly, her hands dropped down from her face and she gulped heavily. Yes, Toshinori proclaimed, laughing a bit. He held his arms up in a flex, deciding to settle back into his public persona. Fear not, for I am. You told my son to keep a secret from me, she exclaimed suddenly. Toshinori froze mid-pose. I beg your pardon? You're darn right you do. Midoriya's mother shouted, causing him to blink. She set her hands on her hips and stared up at him defiantly. What kind of a hero tells a boy to keep a secret from his mother? I have a right to know what goes on in my son's life, especially when his well-being comes into question. Mom, Midoriya tried to interject. Not now, sweetie, mommy is talking, she replied, holding a hand up to silence him. While Midoriya burrowed deeper into Toshinori's coat, she raised an accusatory finger and stared Toshinori down with such an intensity that it almost put Gran Torino's stare down to shame. I get that you're the #1 hero and the symbol of peace, but that doesn't mean you can just do as you please. Oh well, Toshinori began. He chuckled uncomfortably. How much did your son tell you? Oh, I'm not done yet, she cut in. Toshinori found himself stepping back when she took a step towards him. It really bothers me that you would bring a change as big as giving my son a quirk and decide that he shouldn't tell his mother about it. While I trust in my son's judgment and his ability to make decisions, I don't like being kept in the dark when it comes to his safety. Another step caused Toshinori to back up again. And the fact that you're so surprised that he told me only bothers me more. Toshinori's hands went up as soon as his back hit the beach wall. Now, I wasn't trying to. Mom. Midoriya blurted out. It took all of Toshinori's self-control not to slump with relief when his protege stepped into his mother's sights. Oh my God, can you please stop? The fire in her eyes dimmed a bit, but didn't fade. Izuku. Mom, please, Midoriya protested. Please don't yell at him over that, okay? It's my fault for not telling you sooner. I should have told you as soon as possible. Despite the way his form shivered beneath Toshinori's coat, Midoriya's resolve was apparent. He had to be absolutely exhausted, and yet, he had put himself at the epicenter of his mother's ire to take the heat off of Toshinori and take the brunt of her anger. You truly are a brave kid, my boy, Toshinori mused. Still, he also knew that his mother raised a very solid point. He hadn't taken her into consideration when he offered his quirk up to young Midoriya, nor had he thought about the consequences of what would come once Midoriya made it into UA. She raised the boy for his entire life and was present when it became clear he wouldn't develop a quirk. Of course, she would have questions about how he managed to acquire a power like One for All. The memory of all the lunches that young Midoriya would bring to their training sessions caused a weight to settle where Toshinori's stomach used to be. Having to eat the meals his mother made for him while she was left unaware of what her son was training for was likely a cause for stress and inner conflict for the young boy, especially on top of all his training. Toshinori could only imagine how that felt. He didn't have any parents to worry about when it came time for him to inherit One for all those decades ago. Resisting the urge to sigh, Toshinori placed both of his hands onto his protege's shoulders and nudged him to the side. I appreciate the gesture, my boy, Toshinori told him softly, but your mother has a point. Once he was in Mrs. Midoriya's line of sight, he bowed his head. My apologies, ma'am. You have every right to be upset with me. She blinked. What? It was a lapse of judgment on my part, he continued. When Toshinori lifted his head, he placed his hand over his heart. While I never actively encouraged your son to keep things a secret, I also didn't encourage him to tell you either. And for that, I do apologize. All might, Midoriya breathed. Toshinori's eyes drifted towards his protege. I never meant to put you in such a difficult position, young Midoriya. I imagine that. Keeping such a secret from your mother weighed heavy on your heart. He turned back to Mrs. Midoriya. I never meant to come between you and your son, ma'am. I do hope you can forgive me. Oh, she said, clearly taken aback. She shook her head and resumed her glare. You still had my son up late the night before an exam cleaning up a beach. That wasn't his fault. Midoriya protested. He pulled the coat around his shoulders tighter as another shiver ran through his body. I did this all on my own. He only ever asked me to do that one section. Trust me, I was just as surprised as you, Toshinori told her, causing her to turn back to him. I mean, there's not a single speck of trash on this beach. He nearly knocked Midoriya over when he clapped his hand down on his shoulder. You raised quite the hard worker. A light hue of pink went across Mrs. Midoriya's cheeks. Oh, I don't know if I can take credit for that. Izuku has always been determined when it comes to his goals. That's why he's so intent on going to. Then she perked up. Oh, heavens, is Zuko your exam? You still have to get ready. Midoriya's eyes practically bugged out of his head. Oh crap, what time is it? Do I have time to eat? Oh, I still gotta shower and make sure I don't miss the train. I can drive you too, Toshinori offered, causing them to both turn to him. It'd probably be quicker than walking back. His eyes trailed over Mrs. Midoriya. Besides, I'm sure you're freezing in that. Mrs. Midoriya arched her brow in confusion before she looked down and froze. Her cheeks bloomed into a rosy shade of red and she clutched her coat tightly. Oh, I'm still in my jammies. She clapped a hand over her eyes. Of all days to look like a hot mess and I run into All Might? Toshinori managed a chuckle. Oh, you're quite all right. You should see how I look when I first wake up in the morning. He pulled his keys out of his pocket and jingled them. How about we get you two home so you can get nice and ready? We've got a big day ahead of us. All right, Midoriya stammered. Let me just grab my shoes and my shirt? His mother tooted. Izuku, honestly, you're going to catch a cold if you aren't more careful. As Toshinori made his way up the steps with his protege and his mother in tow, he huffed a sigh out through his nose. He was going to have a word with Midoriya once he got the chance. For now, however, he was going to make sure that the boy was primed and focused on the exam. It all comes down to today, he thought as he ascended the stairs. All those months of training are finally going to culminate into this test of strength and agility. He managed a small chuckle. Besides, after this, there's no way that this day can go wrong.